Welcome, dear listener, and thank you for settling in with us tonight. Allow your body to sink gently into the comfort around you, and let your breathing slow to a quiet, easy rhythm as we begin. Tonight, we journey together through one of history's greatest stories, the rise and fall of the vast, magnificent Roman Empire. Each fact has been written to carry you gently through the centuries, like a slow river moving through a landscape of golden stone, marble columns, and the warm, unhurried light of the ancient Mediterranean world. The Eternal City's ancient roots. According to the deeply cherished tradition passed down through centuries of Roman storytelling, the city of Rome was founded in the year 753 BCE by the twin brothers Romulus and Remus, who were said to have been raised by a gentle she-wolf along the banks of the quietly flowing Tiber River. The site chosen for this founding settlement was a series of 7 gentle rolling hills that rose in soft golden-brown curves above the surrounding marshlands and pastoral valleys. Over many quiet generations, what began as a modest collection of thatched-roof huts and simple earthen pathways gradually transformed into one of the most architecturally magnificent cities the ancient world would ever know. The 7 Hills of Rome. The legendary city of Rome was built across 7 distinct hills: the Palatine, Aventine, Capitoline, Esquiline, Viminal, Quirinal, and Celian, each one rising in gentle, rounded contours above the wide, meandering path of the Tiber River far below. These hills gave the early city a natural geography of quiet terraces and softly sloping valleys, where neighborhoods slowly developed their own unique rhythms, markets, and gathering places across the centuries. The Palatine Hill, considered the most prestigious of all 7, became the preferred residence of Rome's emperors, whose grand marble palaces sat nestled among fragrant gardens of lavender, rosemary, and climbing vines that draped over sun-warmed stone wall. From kingdom to republic. For approximately 2.5 centuries after its traditional founding, Rome was governed as a kingdom under a succession of 7 kings, whose reigns shaped the early institutions, religious practices, and social customs that would quietly endure long into the later Republican and imperial eras. In 509 BCE, the Roman nobility peacefully restructured the government into what they called the residential publica, meaning the public thing, or the commonwealth. A system in which 2 elected consuls held executive power for 1-year terms, serving as a gentle balance of shared authority rather than concentrated rule. This transition from monarchy to republic marked one of the most significant quiet turning points in the long, layered story of Roman civilization, establishing patterns of governance that would influence political thought for thousands of years. The Roman Senate's quiet author. IDY. The Roman Senate, whose name derives from the Latin word senex, meaning elder or old man, was one of the most enduring institutions in all of Roman history, functioning in various forms for nearly 1,000 years across the regal, republican, and imperial periods. At its fullest, the Senate consisted of around 600 members drawn from Rome's most distinguished aristocratic families, and they would gather in the warm, colonnaded halls of the Curia building in the Roman Forum to deliberate on matters of law, finance, foreign policy, and religious tradition. The slow, deliberate pace of senatorial debate, conducted in measured Latin phrases beneath ceilings of polished cedar and walls of creamy travertine, gave Roman governance a sense of weight, continuity, and thoughtful authority that shaped the texture of daily life across the entire Mediterranean. RLD. Latin, the quiet root of modern language. Ages. The Latin language, which served as the spoken and written tongue of the Roman world, has left one of the most quietly pervasive legacies in all of human linguistic history, forming the direct root from which the modern Romance languages, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Romanian, all slowly grew and blossomed across many centuries. Even the English language, though primarily Germanic in its ancient structure, carries within it an estimated 40 to 60% of its vocabulary from Latin sources, either borrowed directly or arriving through Norman French, the language of medieval scholars, or ecclesiastical tradition. When a reader today encounters words like urban, civil, legal, or senator, they are gently touching the living surface of a language that was once spoken in the bustling marble forums, quiet countryside villas, and sun-drenched military camps of the ancient Roman world. The scale of the Roman Roadna. One of the most quietly remarkable achievements of Roman engineering was the vast network of paved roads that stretched across the empire like the carefully drawn lines of a spider's web, connecting distant provinces to the heart of Rome with a reliability and precision that would not be matched in Europe for well over 1,000 years after the empire's decline. At its greatest extent, the Roman road system spanned approximately 250,000 miles in total, of which around 50,000 miles were paved with carefully laid stones, flat, broad slabs of basalt or limestone set upon deep layers of compacted gravel, sand, and rubble that provided stability in all seasons and weather. These roads, many of which still lie beneath the quiet earth of modern European cities and countryside, were built with a gentle central camber that allowed rainwater to flow softly to either side, and they were wide enough for two carts to pass each other with unhurried ease. Roman concrete, an ancient inno. But the Romans developed a form of concrete known as opus cementitium, a mixture of volcanic ash called pozzolana, lime, seawater, and aggregate materials, that proved to be one of the most durable building substances ever created by human hands, with certain Roman structures built using this material remaining structurally intact more than 2,000 years after their construction. Modern materials scientists studying ancient Roman harbor structures submerged beneath the warm, still waters of the Mediterranean have discovered that this volcanic concrete actually grows stronger and denser over time as the seawater causes mineral crystals to slowly bloom and interlock within its structure, like delicate frost patterns spreading across a winter pane of glass. This remarkable property of Roman concrete, which modern engineers are still working to fully understand and replicate, helps explain how structures like the Pantheon's enormous, perfectly smooth dome have survived the quiet passage of 20 centuries without significant CR. Hacking. The Pantheon's perf. CT dome. The Pantheon, originally completed around 125 CE during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian, stands as perhaps the most perfectly preserved large-scale building from the ancient Roman world, its graceful circular form and vast coffered dome resting in calm, composed magnificence near the heart of what is today central Rome. The dome's interior diameter measures exactly 43.3 meters, a measurement that is precisely equal to the height from the floor to the apex of the dome, creating a geometrically perfect sphere of interior space that fills with soft, shifting light through the circular open oculus at its crown. This single circular opening, 9 meters across, allows a gentle column of sunlight to move slowly across the deep carved geometric patterns of the coffered ceiling throughout the course of each day, tracing a quiet, meditative arc from one side of the ancient interior to the other as the hours pass. Roman aqueducts, engineering water across the landscape. The Romans constructed a network of 11 major aqueducts feeding the city of Rome alone, alongside hundreds more spread across the provinces of their empire. Engineering. The quiet, gravity-fed flow of fresh water across distances of tens and sometimes hundreds of miles through a system of gently graded channels, subterranean tunnels, soaring arched bridges, and distribution reservoirs called castella. At the height of Rome's population, these aqueducts collectively delivered an estimated 1 million cubic meters of water per day into the city, a volume equivalent to the flow of a steady, unhurried river, supplying the public baths, ornamental fountains, private households, workshops, and gardens with a constant, calm presence of flowing water. The Aqua Claudia, one of Rome's most celebrated aqueducts, stretched for nearly 69 kilometers from its mountain spring source and carried its water along arches of golden brown stone that rose as high as 28 meters above the soft, rolling countryside of the Campania. The Roman Forum, heart of the ancient city. The Roman Forum, known simply as Forum Romanum, served as the beating heart of Roman public life for many centuries, a broad, open rectangular space paved with worn stones set between the gently rising slopes of the Palatine and Capitoline hills, surrounded by a slowly accumulating collection of temples, basilicas, honorary arches, and colonnaded walkways that grew and transformed across the generations. In its busiest centuries, the Forum would have been filled with the unhurried movement of senators in their white togas bordered with wide purple stripes, merchants calling softly from their stalls, priests performing quiet libations before the steps of gleaming marble temples, and citizens gathering to listen to orators speaking from the raised stone platform called the rostra. Today the Forum survives as a landscape of sun-warmed column drums, weathered marble foundations, and scattered carved fragments resting beneath the open Italian sky, still holding within their quiet stones the layered memory of 1,000 years of Roman civic life. Julius Caesar and the calendar. One of Julius Caesar's most enduring and quietly influential contributions to human civilization was his reform of the Roman calendar in 46 BCE, a careful restructuring, developed with the assistance of the Egyptian astronomer Sosigenes of Alexandria, that replaced the old lunar-based Roman calendar with a solar calendar of 365 days divided into 12 months, with an additional leap day inserted every 4 years to account for the gentle, fractional difference between the calendar year and the true solar year. This Julian calendar, named softly in its creator's honor, remained the standard timekeeping system of the Western world for more than 16 centuries, quietly organizing the planting seasons, religious festivals, market days, and civil appointments of countless millions of people across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Even the modern Gregorian calendar, adopted gradually across the world from the 16th century onward, is simply a very minor refinement of Caesar's original solar design, adjusting the leap year rule by a small, precise fraction. The Colosseum's impressive architecture. The Colosseum of Rome, whose construction began under Emperor Vespasian around 70 CE and was completed a decade later under his son Titus, stands as one of the largest and most architecturally sophisticated amphitheaters ever constructed, rising in 4 graceful tiers of arched stone to a height of approximately 48 meters above the ground and stretching 188 meters along its longest axis. The outer facade of the building is composed of 3 superimposed orders of classical architecture: Doric columns on the ground floor, Ionic on the second, and Corinthian on the third, creating a rhythmic, layered visual harmony of light and shadow across the curved stone surface that architects have quietly admired and studied for 2 millennia. Beneath the elliptical floor of the arena lay an intricate network of corridors, storage rooms, and mechanical lift shafts called the hypogeum, an underground world of cool stone passageways that hummed with quiet activity during the preparation for the entertainments above. The Roman population at its peak. At the height of the Roman Empire's territorial and demographic expansion, during the reign of Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century CE, the total population living within Roman-controlled territories has been estimated by scholars and demographers to have reached somewhere between 50 and 90 million people, a figure representing approximately 1/4 of the entire estimated global human population at that time. The city of Rome itself, at its greatest size during the 1st and 2nd century CE, was home to somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million residents, making it the largest city anywhere in the Western world by a wide margin, and one of the largest urban concentrations anywhere on Earth. This extraordinary urban density was supported by a remarkably sophisticated infrastructure of aqueducts, sewers, grain markets, apartment blocks, and public institutions that quietly knit together the daily lives of an enormously diverse population drawn from every corner of the known world. The Pax Romana, 2 centuries of relative peace. The period known to historians as the Pax Romana, Latin for Roman peace, refers to an era of approximately 200 years stretching from the reign of Emperor Augustus in 27 BCE through to the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE, during which the Mediterranean world experienced a sustained period of internal stability, expanding prosperity, and relative freedom from large-scale conflict within the empire's borders. During these quiet centuries, trade flowed steadily along Roman roads and sea lanes, cities grew and beautified themselves with new marble temples and public baths, and the arts, philosophy, engineering, and scholarship all flourished in a cultural atmosphere of calm confidence and accumulated wealth. The Roman historian Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, described this period as quite possibly the most fortunate and tranquil era in all of human history, noting with thoughtful admiration the long span of decades during which an enormous portion of humanity lived under stable, law-governed conditions. Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Gaius Octavius, who took the honorific title Augustus, meaning the revered one, or the August, following his consolidation of power in 27 BCE, became the first true emperor of Rome and one of the most quietly transformative rulers in all of Western history, reigning for a remarkable 41 years until his peaceful passing in 14 CE. Augustus was a man of relatively modest personal habits, preferring simple meals, practical clothing, and the quiet comforts of his home on the Palatine Hill over the ostentatious luxury that some later emperors would cultivate. Yet under his careful, patient governance the Roman state was reshaped from its late republican form into the smoothly administered imperial system that would persist for centuries. He famously claimed, in a phrase recorded by the ancient biographer Suetonius, that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, a poetic expression of the sweeping architectural transformation that his building programs quietly brought to the eternal city. Roman baths as social spaces. The great public bathing complexes of ancient Rome, known as thermae, were among the most remarkable social institutions of the ancient world, functioning not merely as places of physical cleansing but as rich, multifaceted community spaces where citizens of various classes could gather in warm, steam-filled rooms of polished marble to conduct business, discuss philosophy, exercise, have their bodies massaged with fragrant olive oil, read in comfortable libraries, or simply rest in the quiet comfort of the heated air. The largest of all Roman bathing complexes, the Baths of Caracalla, completed around 216 CE, covered an area of approximately 13 hectares and could accommodate an estimated 1,600 bathers at once within its soaring interior halls, whose vaulted ceilings rose to heights of over 30 meters and whose floors were covered in intricate mosaics of warm amber, deep ochre, and cool blue tesserae. These baths were heated through an ingenious system called the hypocaust, in which warm air generated by furnaces burning fragrant wood was circulated slowly through hollow spaces beneath the floors and inside the walls, creating a pervasive, gentle warmth that seeped upward through the marble into the rooms above. The Roman army's organizational genius. The Roman legionary army was organized with a precision and methodical care that made it one of the most effective and adaptable military institutions of the ancient world, structured around the fundamental unit of the legion, a force of approximately 5,000 to 6,000 professional soldiers organized into 10 cohorts, each cohort subdivided into 6 centuries of around 80 men each, commanded by a centurion who carried a vine staff as the quiet symbol of his authority. What distinguished the Roman legionary most fundamentally from many of his contemporaries was not simply his combat training but his extraordinary capacity for engineering and construction. Every Roman legion carried with it a full complement of tools for building roads, bridges, siege works, and the precisely laid-out fortified camps called castra that were erected each evening with calm, systematic regularity wherever the army traveled. The Roman legionaries' standard daily equipment load, which included armor, weapons, tools, rations, and personal belongings, weighed an estimated 40 kilograms, a burden carried with steady, practiced endurance along the stone roads of the empire. Trajan's Column, a stone record. Trajan's Column, completed in Rome in 113 CE to commemorate Emperor Trajan's military campaigns in Dacia, the ancient region corresponding roughly to modern Romania, is one of the most extraordinary surviving artistic and historical documents from the ancient world, a single fluted column of Luna marble rising to a height of approximately 30 meters, around whose exterior spirals a continuous narrative relief carving stretching for nearly 200 meters in total length. The carved frieze depicts over 2,500 individual human figures in intricate, carefully detailed scenes showing the quiet logistics of Roman military life. Soldiers building camps, constructing bridges of timber and stone, loading supply boats, marching in orderly columns through soft forested landscapes, and conducting religious sacrifices at temporary altars. So precise and documentary is the carving that it has served for centuries as one of the primary visual sources for historians and archaeologists seeking to understand the materials, equipment, clothing, and daily routines of the Roman imperial army. The geographic breadth of the Roman Empire. At its greatest territorial extent, reached during the reign of Emperor Trajan around 117 CE, the Roman Empire covered an estimated area of approximately 5 million square kilometers, encompassing territories that in the modern world include Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, Belgium, Switzerland, Romania, Greece, Turkey, Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, England, and Wales, a breadth of geography spanning from the grey, mist-softened shores of northern Britain all the way to the warm golden sands of Mesopotamia near the banks of the Tigris River. This vast domain enclosed within its borders an extraordinary diversity of landscapes, climates, peoples, and cultures, cool, pine-scented alpine valleys, hot desert plateaus baked amber by the African sun, the deep fertile black soils of the Nile Delta, the vine-draped limestone hills of Provence, and the long curved shoreline of the warm blue-green Mediterranean Sea that the Romans called, with quiet possessiveness, Mare Nostrum, our sea. The administrative challenge of governing this enormous and diverse territory was managed through a system of provincial governors, local municipalities, and the vast network of roads and communication routes that allowed information, troops, and goods to move with relative efficiency across its breadth. Roman grain supply in the Annona. Feeding the enormous population of the city of Rome required a logistical system of remarkable scale and sophistication, centered on the state grain supply known as the annona, which organized the importation, storage, and distribution of vast quantities of grain, primarily wheat from the golden, sun-baked agricultural lands of Egypt, Sicily, and North Africa, to sustain the roughly 1 million residents of the capital city. The grain was transported across the Mediterranean in large, wide-bellied cargo ships called naves honorarii, their sails puffed full with warm, steady sea winds as they moved in slow seasonal convoys toward the port of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber River, where the grain was unloaded, transferred to shallow river barges, and then floated gently upstream to the warehouses, called horia, that lined the riverbanks of the city. Some estimates suggest that approximately 400,000 tons of grain were imported into Rome each year during the height of the imperial period, enough to fill many thousands of the great round storage jars called dolia, that lined the cool, vaulted interiors of the state warehouses in long, orderly rows. The Roman alphabet's living legacy. The alphabet used to write the Latin language, a graceful system of 23 original letters later expanded to 26, was adapted by the Romans from the Etruscan alphabet, which was itself derived from a Greek colonial variant, tracing an unbroken chain of cultural transmission reaching back to the ancient Phoenician writing system developed along the gentle cedar-scented coasts of what is today Lebanon. This Roman alphabet, whose elegant letter forms were refined to their classic proportions and carved inscriptions on public monuments during the 1st century BCE, became the model for the writing systems of all Western European languages and, through European global expansion, eventually became the most widely used writing system on the entire surface of the earth. When a person today quietly traces the familiar curves and angles of the letters A, B, C, or M in any note, message, or book, they are writing in a form that, while naturally evolved across the centuries, still carries within its shapes the careful proportions worked out by Roman stone carvers more than 2,000 years ago. Roman numerals and their quiet presence. The Roman numeral system, constructed from 7 basic symbols, I, V, X, L, C, D, and M, representing the values 1, 5, 10, 50, 100, 500, and 1000 respectively, was the standard method of numerical notation used throughout the Roman world for centuries, inscribed on public buildings, carved into milestones, stamped onto coins, and recorded in administrative documents from one end of the empire to the other. Though eventually supplanted in most practical mathematical applications by the more computationally flexible Hindu-Arabic numeral system introduced to Europe through medieval Arabic scholarship, Roman numerals have never entirely departed from human usage, continuing to appear in a quiet, dignified way on clock faces, the chapter numbers of books, the names of monarchs and popes, the numbering of Super Bowls, and the copyright dates on films and television programs. There is something calm and enduring about encountering a Roman numeral, a small, composed bridge across the long, quiet river of time connecting the present moment to the workshops and offices and forum inscriptions of ancient Rome. The Roman villa and its gardens. The Roman country villa, the villa rustica, in its agricultural form, or the villa urbana, in its luxurious leisure form, represented one of the most refined expressions of the Roman wealthy class's deep appreciation for the pleasures of a well-ordered, beautiful natural setting, with elaborate garden spaces carefully designed around symmetrical pathways, clipped topiary hedges of dark, fragrant box, reflecting pools of still water edged with white marble and shaded pergolas draped with climbing roses, grapevines, and jasmine that filled the warm afternoon air with a slow, sweet fragrance. The most lavish imperial villas, such as Hadrian's Villa at Tivoli outside Rome, a sprawling complex covering approximately 120 hectares, incorporated architecture inspired by memorable places from the emperor's extensive travels, recreating the gentle contours of beloved Greek, Egyptian, and Eastern landscapes within a single, carefully tended estate. The Roman appreciation for what they called the odium, the quiet, restorative leisure of a contemplative life spent in beautiful surroundings, infused their villa architecture and garden design with a sense of unhurried, cultivated serenity that still speaks across the centuries. Roman coinage and economic reach. The Roman monetary system, centered on the silver denarius coin that was minted in its classic form from roughly 211 BCE through to the late Empire, created one of the ancient world's first truly large-scale monetary economies, facilitating trade and commerce across the enormous geographic breadth of the empire with a standardized, widely recognized currency that carried the stamped image of the reigning emperor's profile in fine, crisp relief on one face and a carefully chosen symbolic image, or inscription on the reverse. Roman coins have been discovered by archaeologists in locations as distant from Rome as Scotland in the north, sub-Saharan Africa in the south, India in the east, and Ireland in the west. Quiet, traveled ambassadors of Roman economic reach resting in the soil of places the Roman legions never occupied, testifying to the breadth of trade networks radiating outward from the Mediterranean heartland of the empire. The physical composition of the denarius, its precise weight, silver content, and the meticulous quality of its engraving, was maintained with considerable care during the early and middle imperial periods, and when that composition slowly began to change in later centuries as emperors reduced the silver content to stretch the treasury's resources, the change recorded itself quietly in the texture and color of the coins themselves. The Roman Triumph, a ceremonial procession. The Roman triumph was one of the most elaborate and visually magnificent ceremonial rituals in the ancient world, a slow-moving, carefully choreographed procession through the streets of Rome granted by the Senate to a victorious general in recognition of a major military success that met a strict set of qualifying criteria, including a minimum of 5,000 enemy soldiers taken or defeated and a war fought on behalf of the Roman state rather than in personal interest. The triumphing general rode in a tall, gilded four-horse chariot called a quadriga, wearing a toga of deep, wine-dark purple embroidered with golden palm leaves and a crown of laurel leaves resting softly on his head, while behind him walked his soldiers in ordered columns bearing their standards, and before him moved a slow river of captured prisoners, wagons of gleaming spoils, placards naming conquered cities, and actors and musicians setting a rhythmic, processional pace. Ancient writers record that a slave stood behind the triumphant general in the chariot, holding a golden wreath over his head and whispering the quiet reminder, "Memento mori, remember that you are mortal," as the crowds cheered from balconies and flower petals drifted down upon the procession like a gentle rain. Hadrian's Wall, a stone boundary across Britain. Hadrian's Wall, commissioned by Emperor Hadrian following his visit to the northern province of Britannia in 122 CE, stretches for approximately 117 kilometers, 73 miles, across the narrow northern waste of the island of Britain, running from the Solway Firth on the western coast to the mouth of the River Tyne on the eastern, tracing a gentle, undulating line across moorland and rocky escarpments that still carry its presence in long, low runs of gray and golden-brown stone visible today. The wall was constructed from local stone quarried in the nearby hills, built to a height of approximately 4.5 to 6 meters and a thickness of around 3 meters, with a series of small gate towers called mile castles spaced precisely 1 Roman mile apart along its entire length, and larger fortified garrison forts built at regular intervals to house the soldiers responsible for its maintenance and administration. The wall represented not simply a military fortification but a complex administrative border zone, complete with customs processing points, signal stations, patrol roads, and the quiet daily routines of thousands of soldiers drawn from all across the empire, men from Syria, Germany, Spain, and North Africa, stationed on this windswept northern edge of the Roman world. Roman glass, a transparent luxury. The Romans developed glassblowing and glass manufacturing to a level of technical sophistication and artistic refinement that produced objects of extraordinary delicacy and beauty, thin-walled vessels of pale aquamarine, smoky gray, amber, and deep cobalt blue, their surfaces sometimes decorated with delicate threads of contrasting colored glass trailed in soft, flowing patterns around their forms, or cut with the precise, patient strokes of a craftsman's wheel to reveal geometric facets or pictorial scenes in cameo relief. Roman glassmakers working in the workshops of the Rhineland, Syria, Alexandria, and Italy developed the technique of mold blowing that allowed them to produce glass vessels in consistent forms bearing fine decorative detail, and the finest examples of Roman glass art, such as the Portland vase in the British Museum, carved from a deep midnight blue glass with white cameo figures in supple, graceful poses, remain among the most technically demanding objects ever produced in glass before or since. Window glass, made by blowing and flattening glass into rough sheets, was used in more prosperous Roman buildings to fill window openings with a surface that admitted the soft, diffused quality of outdoor light while keeping out the cold and wind, a quiet domestic comfort that speaks to the everyday sophistication of Roman material culture. The Roman legal system's enduring influence. Roman law, which developed through many centuries of careful, deliberate elaboration from the earliest written legal code of the 12 tables inscribed around 450 BCE through to the great systematic compilations of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in the 6th century CE, represents one of the most comprehensive and intellectually sophisticated bodies of legal thought ever developed in the ancient world, and its influence on the legal systems of modern Western civilization is so deep and pervasive that it can scarcely be overstated. Fundamental legal concepts that are taken for granted in modern legal practice: the presumption of innocence, the right to a legal defense, the distinction between public and private law, the legal concept of a corporation as a separate entity, and the idea that laws should be written, public, and knowable, all have their carefully reasoned origins in the quiet work of Roman legal scholars known as jurists, who over many centuries built up an enormous body of nuanced legal analysis. The legal systems of France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Scotland, Quebec, Louisiana, and nearly all of Latin America trace their fundamental structures back, through various historical pathways, to the enduring architecture of Roman law, a legacy as structural and invisible as the foundations of old buildings running quietly beneath modern city streets. Roman mosaic art, patterns of stone and glass. Roman mosaic art, created from thousands upon thousands of tiny colored pieces of stone, glass, or terracotta called tesserae, represented one of the most labor-intensive and visually striking decorative arts of the ancient world, covering the floors and walls of Roman houses, villas, baths, and public buildings with images ranging from simple geometric patterns of interlocking black and white forms to richly detailed pictorial scenes depicting mythological narratives, landscapes, still life arrangements, and portraits rendered with a painterly subtlety of color and shading. The most accomplished Roman mosaic workshops, particularly those of North Africa, where an extraordinarily rich tradition of floor mosaics survived in the ruins of cities like Carthage, the Berbo Magus, and Al-Jem, could achieve effects of almost photographic delicacy in the depiction of the shimmering iridescence of fish scales, the soft translucency of ripe fruit, or the play of dappled light across the surface of a garden pool. Walking across a Roman mosaic floor, one would have felt beneath one's feet the hard, slightly uneven surface of thousands of individual tesserae set in their white plaster bed, while the eye was drawn across a world of geometric harmony and narrative beauty composed entirely from small fragments of earth and stone. The Roman patron-client system. One of the most distinctive and quietly pervasive social structures of Roman society was the patron-client relationship, a system of formalized mutual obligation in which wealthy and influential citizens called patrons provided legal assistance, financial support, introductions, and social protection to those of lower status called clients, who in return offered their patrons political support, public demonstrations of respect, and the practical assistance of their labor, skills, or social connections. Each morning in Rome, clients would make the ritual call to their patron's house known as the salutatio, gathering in the atrium to greet their patron, pay their respects, and perhaps receive small gifts of money called sportuli, a quiet, daily social ritual that reinforced the hierarchical bonds of Roman society while also providing the social mobility and economic support that allowed the system to function with a degree of genuine reciprocal benefit. This web of patron-client relationships extended upward through every level of Roman society, from humble freedmen and craftsmen at one end all the way to great aristocratic families who were themselves in a sense clients of the emperor, creating an intricate, layered social fabric that held Roman civilization together with threads of obligation, gratitude, and carefully maintained mutual respect. Roman fresco painting and interior color. The interior walls of Roman houses and villas were frequently adorned with fresco paintings of extraordinary variety and sophistication, applied in thin layers of pigment onto fresh plaster while it was still soft and slightly damp, so that the colors bonded chemically with the wall surface and acquired a quiet, luminous depth that has survived in many cases for 2,000 years, particularly in those buildings that were sealed beneath the preserving volcanic ash of Vesuvius at Pompeii and Herculaneum in 79 CE. Roman fresco painters worked with a palette of deep Pompeian reds, soft golden yellows, cool greens, black, white, and the rare, expensive Egyptian blue, a synthetic pigment made from a mixture of sand, limestone, and copper or heated to high temperatures, to create elaborate compositions that transformed the enclosed space of a Roman room into something larger and more luminous than its physical dimensions. The most sophisticated second-style Roman frescoes of the 1st century BCE created the illusion of wide, airy architectural vistas beyond the solid walls of a room, with columns, doorways, and receding colonnades painted with such skill and spatial understanding that the boundary between interior and exterior space seemed to dissolve into a calm, painted infinity. The role of the Roman family. The Roman family, the familia, was the fundamental unit of Roman social, economic, and religious organization, structured around the authority of the eldest male member known as the paterfamilias, whose legal and social power over the members of his household was extensive and formally recognized by Roman law, encompassing his wife, children of all ages, slaves, freedmen, and any other dependents living under his roof. The Roman household also served as the center of private religious practice, with a small domestic shrine called the lararium, typically occupying a niche or corner in the main living area, before which the family would quietly gather each day to make small offerings of incense, grain, or wine to the laras, the household protective spirits, and the penates, guardians of the family's stored provisions and continuing prosperity. The physical form of the Roman house itself, organized around a central open-roofed hall called the atrium, where a shallow pool called the impluvium collected rainwater falling from above, reflected in its architecture the Roman family's deep sense of the relationship between the enclosed domestic world and the wider sky, seasons, and natural world beyond its walls. Roman astronomy and the measurement of time. The Romans inherited and built upon the rich astronomical traditions of the Greeks and Babylonians, incorporating sophisticated knowledge of the movements of the celestial bodies into their calendar systems, their religious festivals, their agricultural planning, and the astrological practices that permeated everyday life at every social level, from the humblest farmer consulting the stars before planting his fields to the emperor consulting court astrologers before making major decisions. Roman timekeeping used sundials, elegant instruments of stone, bronze, or marble calibrated for the latitude of the city where they stood, to divide the daylight hours into 12 equal parts, and water clocks called clepsydry, to mark the passage of time during the darker hours of the night or in interior spaces where sunlight could not reach the face of a sundial. The gradual Roman refinement of the Julian calendar, working from the best astronomical data available to them, produced a solar year of 365.25 days that departed from the true tropical solar year by only approximately 11 minutes. A remarkably small error reflecting the careful, patient astronomical observation of Roman and Hellenistic scholars working with instruments of graceful mechanical simplicity. The Roman postal system, the cursus publicus. The cursus publicus, the Roman imperial postal and transport system established by Emperor Augustus, was one of the ancient world's most sophisticated state communication networks, consisting of a series of relay stations spaced approximately every 8 to 12 Roman miles along the principal road routes of the empire, where official couriers could exchange tired horses for fresh ones, rest briefly, and continue their journeys with minimal interruption, allowing important messages and dispatches to move across the empire at speeds that seem quietly impressive even by modern standards for a pre-mechanical world. A message sent by official imperial courier from Rome to the frontier province of Britannia, traveling the relay stations of the cursus publicus along the roads of Italy, Gaul, and across the Channel, could cover the approximately 1,800 miles in somewhere between 3 and 4 weeks under favorable conditions, a pace that ensured the emperor and his administration could maintain meaningful communication with the furthest corners of their vast domain. The stations of the cursus publicus were also used for the transport of official goods and personnel, their modest stone buildings and attached stables scattered at quiet intervals along the long, straight roads of the empire like beads on an endless thread. Roman textile trade and luxury goods. The Roman economy maintained an extensive and remarkably far-reaching trade network that brought luxury goods from distant corners of the known world into the markets and private homes of the Roman Empire. Fine silks and spices from China and Southeast Asia traveling the Silk Road caravan routes through Central Asia and Persia, aromatic incense of frankincense and myrrh from the warm, dry uplands of Arabia and the Horn of Africa, cotton textiles from India, ivory from sub-Saharan Africa, amber, from the shores of the Baltic Sea, and black pepper from the Malabar coast of southern India that commanded prices by weight comparable to silver. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, composing his encyclopedic natural history in the 1st century CE, expressed a quiet unease at the enormous quantities of gold coin that flowed eastward from Rome each year to pay for these luxury imports, estimating the annual drain at 100 million sesterces, a figure that testifies to the remarkable depth and value of Rome's long-distance commercial connections. Warehouses in the port city of Alexandria held goods from Africa, Arabia, and India in their vast, cool interiors, while the harbor at Puteoli near Naples was crowded with the tall masts and furled linen sails of merchant ships arriving from every accessible corner of the Mediterranean and beyond. The Roman concept of Romanitas. One of the most quietly fascinating aspects of Roman civilization was the concept the Romans themselves referred to as Romanitas, a term encompassing the shared cultural identity, social values, civic practices, and Latin language that bound together the enormously diverse peoples of the empire into something that functioned, despite all the differences of geography and ethnic origin, as a coherent and recognizable civilization. Unlike many ancient empires that maintained a sharp, legally enforced distinction between the ruling people and their subjects, Rome gradually extended its concept of citizenship outward in widening circles. First to neighboring Italian peoples, then to provincials who had served in the army or achieved certain civic distinctions, and finally in 212 CE when Emperor Caracalla issued the Constitutio Antoniniana, granting Roman citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire, regardless of their place of origin, making a Spanish merchant, a Syrian artisan, and a North African farmer all equally Roman in the eyes of the law. This expansive, inclusive approach to cultural identity meant that Roman civilization was from very early times a hybrid, absorbing, and eclectic phenomenon: Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, Eastern spices, Germanic gods, and Gallic hairstyles all quietly mingling in the great, warm, sunlit mixing bowl of the Mediterranean world. The Roman theater and its architecture. Roman theatrical architecture, which evolved from the temporary wooden performance spaces of the early Republican period to the grand permanent stone theaters of the Imperial Age, developed a distinctive form quite different from the Greek hillside theaters from which it partly descended. The Roman theater was a self-contained, freestanding structure in which the semicircular seating area called the cavea was integrated directly with the elaborate permanent stage building called the skene. Fronds, creating a closed, unified architectural ensemble of considerable visual magnificence. The skene fronds of a large Roman theater was a towering wall of tiered columns, ornamental niches, carved entablatures, and projecting pediments faced in marble of contrasting colors, white Carrara, golden Numidian, and deep green porphyry, creating a backdrop of intricate, layered richness behind the performers that both framed the action and demonstrated the wealth and civic ambition of the city that had built it. The Theatre of Marcellus in Rome, dedicated around 13 BCE, provided the direct architectural model for the design of the Colosseum built a century later, its curved exterior facade of stacked Doric and Ionic arcades establishing the rhythmic formal language that would define Roman monumental architecture for generations. Roman hydraulic engineering, dams and water mills. Beyond their celebrated aqueducts, the Romans demonstrated considerable ingenuity in hydraulic engineering through the construction of dams, drainage canals, harbor works, and water-powered mills, creating a landscape of managed water that served the agricultural, industrial, and urban needs of their civilization across the breadth of the empire. At Barbegal in southern France, archaeologists have discovered the remains of what was once an extraordinary industrial milling complex. 16 water wheels arranged in 2 parallel descending rows cut into a hillside near Alls, powered by a mill race fed from a branch aqueduct, turning millstones that collectively could produce enough flour each day to supply the estimated bread needs of a population of around 12,500 people. Roman engineers also constructed masonry dams across river valleys in Spain, North Africa, Syria, and Jordan to create reservoirs for agricultural irrigation and urban water supply, some of which, like the Proserpina Dam in Spain whose curved masonry wall still stands, held their water for centuries and remained in use well into the medieval period, quiet stone survivors of an ancient hydraulic tradition. The Roman education system. Education in the Roman world progressed through a sequence of carefully structured stages beginning in the home, where young children of literate families received their earliest instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic from their parents or a household slave called a pedagogus. Often a well-educated Greek slave who was responsible both for tutoring and for gently supervising the child's moral development and public behavior. The next stage of formal education took place under the guidance of a grammaticus, a professional teacher who instructed students in Latin and Greek grammar, literature, history, and the close reading of canonical texts, particularly the works of Virgil and Homer. In small schoolrooms that often occupied rented spaces in the ground floors of apartment buildings or beneath the colonnaded porticos of public spaces, accessible to the sound of the city's daily life drifting in from the streets. Outside. Advanced education in rhetoric, the art of persuasive, well-structured public speaking, was provided by the reader, and mastery of this art was considered the crowning intellectual achievement of a Roman gentleman's education, the skill most directly useful in the law courts, the Senate, and the public life of the city where a well-turned phrase could quietly shape the course of events. Roman olive oil, liquid gold of the ancient world. Olive oil played a role in Roman civilization of extraordinary breadth and centrality that goes far beyond its familiar modern use as a cooking ingredient, serving simultaneously as the primary fuel for lamps and the soft, amber golden light they cast through domestic and public spaces, as the base for perfumes and scented unguents, as a material for soap making, as a preservative for food and leather goods, as a lubricant for mechanical equipment, and as a fundamental component of the bathing ritual in which oil was applied to the skin before a bronze strigil was drawn across the surface to remove it along with the day's accumulated grime. The olive groves that covered the hillsides of Spain, North Africa, Greece, Syria, and Italy produced oil in quantities that supplied not only the agricultural regions themselves but the entire urban breadth of the empire through a well-organized trade network, with oil shipped in large ceramic containers called amphorae, thousands upon thousands of which have been recovered from Roman shipwrecks scattered across the Mediterranean seafloor. The great amphora dump of Monte Testaccio on the outskirts of Rome, an artificial hill approximately 35 meters high composed entirely of the broken fragments of some 53 million discarded olive oil amphorae, stands today as a quiet, massive monument to the scale of Rome's oil consumption across the first 3 centuries of the imperial era. The Roman arch and its structural logic. The semicircular arch, which the Romans inherited from earlier Etruscan and Near Eastern building traditions but developed into one of the most versatile and widely deployed structural elements in their architecture, works through the quiet, self-reinforcing logic of compression, the wedge-shaped stones called voussoirs, that make up the arch pressing inward and downward against each other under the weight of whatever they support. The more weight they carry, the more securely they lock together, distributing forces sideways into the abutments or piers at either end without any need for mortar to bind the joints. This structural principle, which the Romans understood through long practical experience rather than formal mathematical analysis, allowed them to build bridges of remarkable span and lightness over the rivers of their empire, bridges like the Pont du Gard in southern France, whose 3 tiers of graceful stone arches rise to a height of 49 meters above the green valley of the Gardon River and carry the channel of an aqueduct across a span of 275 meters with a precision that has maintained the aqueduct's gentle gradient of 2.5 centimeters per kilometer across its entire length. The arch also made possible the great barrel-vaulted and cross-vaulted ceilings of Roman interior spaces, which translated the spanning logic of the arch into 3 dimensions and created the soaring, enclosed volumes that give Roman public buildings their characteristic quality of monumental, light-filled calm. Roman perfumery and scented luxury. The Roman world was deeply saturated with fragrance, in a civilization that used scented oils and unguents as fundamental personal care products rather than merely luxury items, that burned incense of frankincense and myrrh in its temples and at its domestic altars, that strewed the petals of roses, violets, and saffron flowers across the floors of banquet rooms and the paths of triumphal processions, and that even scented the sails of ships with aromatic substances. The crafting, trading, and wearing of perfume was an industry of enormous social and commercial significance. Roman perfumers, working in the unguentarii or workshops of Capua, Aquileia, and other production centers, combined imported aromatics, cinnamon and spikenard from India, frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Somalia, balsam from Judea, iris root from Macedonia, with base oils of sesame, almond, or olive, creating complex, layered compositions that were stored in beautiful little glass or alabaster vessels and applied with small applicator rods to the skin, hair, or clothing. The great perfumery market of ancient Capua was famous throughout the Mediterranean world for the quality and variety of its scented products, and the long, slow camel caravans bringing aromatics from Arabia along the incense road to the Mediterranean ports were maintained by the Roman world's quiet, steady appetite for fragrance. Marcus Aurelius and Stoic philosophy. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled as Roman emperor from 161 to 180 CE and is widely regarded as one of the most admirable and thoughtful rulers in all of Roman history, was a devoted practitioner of Stoic philosophy, a Greek school of thought that taught the importance of living in accordance with reason and nature, maintaining equanimity in the face of circumstances beyond one's control, cultivating virtue as the only true good, and recognizing the deep interconnection of all rational beings within the larger community of humanity. His private philosophical journal, known to us as the Meditations, written in Greek apparently for his own personal reflection rather than for public circulation, consists of a series of short, quietly penetrating passages in which Marcus examines his own character with gentle ruthlessness, reminds himself of Stoic principles, and meditates on the transience of all things and the importance of acting well in the brief time available to each human life. The Meditations, which were never intended as a published work and might easily have been lost entirely to the quiet erosion of time, has survived in a single manuscript tradition to become one of the most widely read and quietly beloved works of ancient literature. Its calm, measured reflections on duty, acceptance, and the inner life speaking across the distance of nearly 2 millennia with a voice of remarkable gentleness and sincerity. Roman underfloor heating, the hypocaust. The Roman hypocaust system, a method of underfloor and in-wall heating that warmed the floors and spaces of bath buildings, wealthy private houses, and some public buildings, was one of the most comfortable and technically clever domestic engineering achievements of the ancient world, constructed by raising the floor on a grid of small brick pillars called pili, approximately 60 to 90 centimeters above the ground level, creating a hollow space through which warm air generated by an external furnace burning wood or charcoal could circulate freely before rising through hollow tiles built into the walls and exiting through flues in the ceiling. The result was a gentle, pervasive warmth radiating upward through the floor surface, particularly effective in bathing rooms where bathers walked barefoot on tiles of warm marble or terracotta, that must have felt profoundly luxurious in the cold months of the Italian winter or the long chilly evenings of northern provincial postings. The temperature of hypocaust heated rooms could be adjusted by the slaves responsible for tending the furnace, adding more wood to increase the warmth, allowing the fire to subside for a gentler heat, creating a form of environmental control that, while more laborious than modern central heating, achieved a comparable effect of surrounding the inhabitants of a building with a steady, ambient warmth on even the coldest of winter days. The Roman Games, chariot racing at the Circus Maximus. Chariot racing was the most popular spectator sport of the Roman world, drawing enormous crowds to the great racing venues called circuses, the largest of which, the Circus Maximus in Rome, could accommodate an estimated 150,000 to 250,000 spectators in its tiered seating along the 2 long sides and curved end of the track, making it by some estimates the largest sports venue ever constructed in terms of capacity in all of human history. The races were organized around the 4 racing factions, the Blues, Greens, Reds, and Whites, each with their own stables of horses, teams of charioteers, and massively devoted fan bases whose passionate partisan loyalties divided and animated the crowds, with ordinary Romans identifying strongly with their chosen faction the way modern sports fans identify with favorite teams. A standard race consisted of 7 laps around the long central dividing barrier called the spina, which was decorated with ornamental obelisks, fountains, bronze sculptures, and large egg-shaped and dolphin-shaped lap counters that were turned at each end of the barrier to mark the progress of the race with a slow counting rhythm as the chariots swept past in a swirl of dust and flying sand. Roman wine culture. Wine was central to Roman culture in a way that permeated every social level and every aspect of life from the sacred to the practical. Poured as a libation before meals and at religious rites, consumed at the convivial gatherings called convivia or symposia, where the business of social relationship, philosophical discussion, and entertainment was conducted. mixed with seawater, herbs, honey, or warm spices according to the taste and fashion of the occasion, and transported and sealed. Ceramic amphorae from the vineyards of Campania, Sicily, Spain, Gaul, and the Aegean to every corner of the empire. Roman viticulture was practiced with considerable technical knowledge and pride in regional distinction. The wines of the Alban Hills near Rome, the slopes of Vesuvius in Campania, the coastal estates of Falernian territory, and the volcanic soils of the Aeolian Islands each produced wines with recognized and valued characteristics, much as modern wine culture recognizes the particular qualities of specific appellations. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder recorded over 50 distinct wine-producing regions in his Natural History, noting with a careful connoisseur's precision the qualities of the soil, climate, and grape varieties responsible for the character of each wine, a form of viticultural knowledge that, while interrupted and transformed by the passage of centuries, was never entirely lost from the Mediterranean wine traditions that quietly survived the empire's transformation. The Roman catacombs. The catacombs of Rome, extensive underground burial complexes excavated through the soft, workable tufa rock beneath the Roman countryside along the principal roads leading out of the city, represent a remarkable and peaceful dimension of Roman funerary culture, consisting of long, dimly lit corridors and larger chambers carved at multiple levels into the earth, their walls pierced with rows of rectangular burial niches called loculi, where the deceased were laid to rest wrapped in linen and sealed behind thin slabs of marble or terracotta. The catacomb system around Rome is estimated to extend for a total of approximately 150 to 170 kilometers of underground passages, accommodating the remains of hundreds of thousands of individuals interred over several centuries from the 1st through 5th centuries CE, making them one of the largest and most complex burial environments created by any ancient civilization. The walls and ceilings of some catacomb chambers are decorated with fresco paintings of quiet, luminous beauty, pastoral landscapes of golden light, symbolic images of doves and grapevines, and narrative scenes rendered in the warm, earthy pigments of late antique art, that fill the underground spaces with a sense of gentle, contemplative peace that has given these ancient corridors a quality of profound, unhurried stillness. Roman literature, Virgil's Aeneid. Virgil's Aeneid, composed between approximately 29 and 19 BCE and left unfinished at its author's passing, stands as the greatest epic poem of the Latin literary tradition and one of the most carefully crafted works of poetic art in all of Western literature, telling in 12 books of flowing, carefully weighted Latin hexameter verse the story of Aeneas, a Trojan hero fated by the gods to become the founding ancestor of the Roman people, as he travels from the ruins of Troy through the Mediterranean world toward his destiny in Italy. Virgil worked on the poem for approximately 11 years with extraordinary care, reportedly composing rough prose drafts of each section before refining them into verse, and ancient sources record that he would sometimes labor for an entire day over a single line, adjusting and re-examining its sound, rhythm, and meaning with the patient, meditative attention of a craftsman applying the finest finishing touches to a work of art. The Aeneid was such a towering presence in Roman literary culture that it was used as the primary text for Latin education within decades of its publication, studied, memorized, and quoted by generations of Roman schoolchildren, and it has maintained a continuous, quiet presence in Western literary tradition from the late classical period through the present day. Its verses still read aloud in their original Latin in university classrooms around the world. The Roman Insulae, urban apartment living. The majority of Rome's enormous urban population did not live in the spacious private houses with their calm, impluvium-centered atria that feature so prominently in the popular imagination of Roman domestic life, but rather in multi-story apartment buildings called insulae, islands of housing surrounded by streets, that rose to heights of 4, 5, or sometimes 6 stories above the bustling street level, their upper floors accessed by wooden interior staircases and renting for decreasing amounts the higher one climbed above the ground. The ground floors of insulae typically housed shops, taverns, or workshops whose wide, hinged shutters opened directly onto the street, while the upper floors were divided into suites of rooms of varying size and quality, the lower and larger apartments occupied by more prosperous tenants who could afford more spacious quarters, and the smallest, least expensive rooms under the roof accessible only through the longest climb. The Emperor Augustus, concerned by the structural integrity of the tallest residential buildings in the increasingly crowded city, issued a regulation limiting the height of new insulae to approximately 20 meters, a measure that established one of history's earliest building codes, reflecting the ancient Roman tradition of the state taking a quiet, practical interest in the safety and order of the urban environment. Roman engineering, the Cloaca Maxima. The Cloaca Maxima, the greatest sewer, was one of the earliest and most impressive engineering works of the ancient Roman world, an underground drainage channel originally constructed during the period of the Roman kings in approximately the 6th century BCE to drain the marshy lowland between the hills of Rome that would become the Forum, and later expanded and elaborated into a covered masonry tunnel that channeled the effluent and runoff of the entire city of Rome into the Tiber River. The main channel of the Cloaca Maxima, lined with carefully fitted blocks of grata oscura tufa stone, measured approximately 3.2 meters high and 4 meters wide at its grandest section, large enough that ancient writers describe boats floating through it, and its barrel-vaulted interior has survived largely intact beneath the streets of modern Rome, still functioning as part of the city's drainage infrastructure more than 2,500 years after its initial construction. The existence of the Cloaca Maxima as the foundation of a comprehensive urban sanitation system, supplemented by the constant flushing action of the overflow from Rome's many public fountains and baths, gave the city of Rome a degree of basic sanitary infrastructure that made it extraordinarily advanced by the standards of the ancient world, and whose essential principles would not be systematically replicated in European cities until the great municipal engineering programs of the 19th century. The Roman province of Egypt. When Rome absorbed Egypt following the deaths of Mark Antony and Cleopatra 7 and 30 BCE, the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty that had governed Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great 3 centuries earlier, it acquired not merely a new territorial possession but the most productive agricultural land in the entire ancient world, a narrow ribbon of deep, dark, nitrogen-rich alluvial soil deposited annually by the flooding Nile that could yield harvests of wheat and barley of extraordinary abundance in the warm, rainless Egyptian climate. Egypt was so valuable and strategically important that Augustus treated it as a personal imperial domain rather than an ordinary province, appointing its governor from the equestrian class rather than the senatorial class and prohibiting senators from even visiting the country without express imperial permission, an arrangement that acknowledged the province's unique sensitivity as the breadbasket upon which Rome's urban population depended. The landscape of Roman Egypt was a world of extraordinary visual contrast. The narrow band of vibrant, irrigated green farmland bordering the Nile gradually giving way on either side to the wide, still, golden amber surface of the desert that extended without interruption to the horizons, with the great stone monuments of the earlier pharaonic civilization rising from the farmland and desert edges like quiet giants presiding over a changed but continuous world. Roman numeracy and surveying. Roman surveyors and engineers achieved remarkable precision in their practical measurement and calculation work using instruments of elegant simplicity. The groma, a cross-shaped instrument with plumb bobs hanging from its arms that allowed the establishment of perfectly perpendicular sight lines across the landscape, and the chorobates, a long, water-level instrument used to establish true horizontals over distances of many hundreds of meters when planning the gentle gradients required for aqueduct channels. Using these instruments with practiced skill, Roman survey teams could establish the perfectly straight lines of a new road or the precisely calculated declination of an aqueduct channel across varied terrain with a consistency that modern laser-level surveys have confirmed to be accurate to within centimeters over distances of many kilometers. The Roman surveying tradition was systematic enough to support the production of detailed land survey maps for the purpose of agricultural property registration. The cadastral surveys whose carefully inscribed bronze map tablets, fragments of which survive from the Roman colony of Orange in southern France, show a vast landscape divided into precise rectangular blocks by a grid of roads and drainage channels laid out with the quiet, methodical order that the Romans imposed wherever they settled. The Roman concept of odium and negotium. Roman intellectual and philosophical life was organized around a fundamental distinction between two modes of human existence: negotium, meaning the active engagement with the demanding, important work of public life, politics, law, military command, and civic administration, and odium, meaning the restorative, contemplative withdrawal from public activity into private study, conversation, reading, writing, and the quiet pleasures of nature and philosophy. This was not a simple hierarchy in which one activity was considered superior to the other, but rather a nuanced appreciation for the way in which each enriched and sustained the other. A Roman statesman who spent weeks of concentrated effort on legal cases or administrative challenges would withdraw to his country villa during the summer months for a period of calm reading, philosophical correspondence with friends, and peaceful walks through his carefully tended gardens, returning to public life refreshed and intellectually replenished. The letters of Cicero, the essays of Pliny the Younger, and the philosophical dialogues of Seneca all embody this deeply Roman alternation between the engaged, purposeful world of public action and the quiet, inward-turning world of personal reflection and cultivation. A rhythm of activity and rest that still seems, across the centuries, like a fundamentally wise and human approach to the passage of time. The Roman treatment of conquered cultures. One of the most intellectually interesting aspects of Roman imperial culture was the remarkable degree to which it absorbed, adopted, and actively celebrated the cultural achievements of the peoples it conquered, most spectacularly in the case of Greece, where the Romans, having militarily subdued the Greek world in the 2nd century BCE, promptly acknowledged the cultural and intellectual superiority of Greek civilization in philosophy, science, art, and literature, sending their children to be educated by Greek tutors and in Greek cities, filling their libraries with Greek texts, decorating their houses with Greek sculpture, and adapting Greek architectural forms, religious concepts, and philosophical schools into the fabric of Roman civilization with an enthusiasm that the poet Horace captured memorably in the line, "Captured Greece took her rude conqueror captive." This quality of cultural receptivity and assimilation, the ability to recognize value in the traditions of others and to incorporate them into one's own civilization without feeling threatened, was one of the quietly distinctive strengths of Roman culture, and helps explain how a civilization that began as a small settlement on the banks of the Tiber was able to grow into a vessel capacious enough to hold the cultural inheritance of the entire Mediterranean world. Roman medicine and the legacy of Galen. Roman medicine, which drew heavily on the Greek medical tradition established by Hippocrates and developed significantly through the work of Greco-Roman physician Galen of Pergamon in the 2nd century CE, achieved a level of systematic anatomical knowledge and clinical practice that would remain the foundational framework of Western medicine for approximately 1,400 years until it was gradually revised and superseded through the direct anatomical investigations of the Renaissance. Galen, who worked as physician to gladiators in Pergamon before becoming court physician to Emperor Marcus Aurelius in Rome, produced a body of medical writing of extraordinary scope and methodological ambition, covering anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, nutrition, and clinical diagnosis in detailed works whose accumulated length exceeded those of any previous medical writer, and whose confident, systematic authority gave them a quiet permanence in the medical curriculum that proved both immensely useful and, in some respects, limiting for later generations of physicians. Roman military medicine was particularly advanced in the practical management of surgical care, with legionary hospitals called valetudinaria, systematic facilities with individual wards, operating rooms, latrines, and pharmaceutical storage, providing the Roman army with a level of organized medical support that would not be regularly matched in Western military practice until well into the modern era. The Temple of the Pantheon's materials. The Pantheon's construction involved an extraordinary variety of carefully sourced and precisely deployed building materials, with each component selected for its structural and aesthetic properties and transported to Rome from quarries scattered across the Mediterranean world. The granite columns of its famous porch, each standing 11.8 meters tall and weighing approximately 60 tons, were quarried at Mons Claudianus in the remote Egyptian desert and transported hundreds of miles across the desert sand and then by sea to the port of Rome, an organizational feat of quietly impressive logistical complexity. The interior of the dome is composed of concrete of varying composition, with heavier materials like travertine limestone and tufa aggregate used in the lower sections where structural loads are greatest, and progressively lighter materials including pumice stone used in the upper sections near the oculus where weight reduction was most critical, demonstrating the empirical structural understanding of Roman engineers who had worked out through experience the principles of load distribution that modern structural analysis confirms with mathematical precision. The smooth, polished floor of the Pantheon's circular interior is composed of a geometric pattern of roundels and squares and contrasting stones. White Pentelic marble, deep purple porphyry from Egypt, and golden giallo antico from North Africa, creating beneath one's feet a rich, grounded texture of color and material that complements the soft, moving light falling from the open eye of the dome high above. Roman gold and silver craftsmanship. The goldsmiths and silversmiths of the Roman world produced luxury metalwork objects of extraordinary technical refinement and decorative invention. Silver dinner services embossed with mythological scenes in high relief, gold necklaces set with emeralds of deep, still green from Egyptian mines, silver mirror backs chased with patterns of grapevines and hunting scenes, and elaborate fibula brooches in gold filigree decorated with granulation work so delicate that individual gold spheres less than a millimeter in diameter were fused to the surface in patterns of botanical precision. The Boscorial treasure and the Hildesheim treasure, both discovered in the 19th century and now held in major museum collections, preserve extraordinary examples of Roman silver tableware, their surfaces gleaming with the warm, mellow luster of old silver and carrying in their embossed decoration a record of Roman mythological narratives, allegorical imagery, and decorative taste rendered in three-dimensional form. Roman goldsmiths working in the workshops of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch had access to a wide variety of precious and semi-precious stones from across the known world. Emeralds from the Egyptian Eastern Desert, sapphires from Ceylon, garnets from Bohemia, amethysts from Arabia, and pearls from the Persian Gulf, combining them with cast and worked gold in designs of controlled elegance that speak to the high level of aesthetic refinement maintained by the most accomplished craftsmen of the ancient Mediterranean luxury trade. The Roman imperial post and information flow. The speed at which information moved through the Roman imperial communication system had direct consequences for the stability and effective governance of the empire, and the emperors were acutely aware of this. Dispatches from the eastern frontier could take approximately 3 weeks to reach Rome under favorable conditions, meaning that by the time an emperor received news of a distant development and formulated a response that reached the frontier commander, 6 weeks or more might have elapsed, requiring a level of delegated authority and local initiative at the provincial level that gave Roman provincial governance a quiet, distributed quality quite different from the centralized modern state. News within the city of Rome itself was disseminated through a combination of the Acta Diurna, a daily official gazette posted on white-painted boards in public places from the time of Julius Caesar onward, recording official announcements, Senate proceedings, legal decisions, and significant births and passings, and the informal but highly efficient social network of the morning salutatio and the afternoon conversations in the colonnaded gardens of the public baths, through which information moved with the quiet, organic efficiency of a well-tended flow of water through a city's channels. The large number of educated Romans who wrote and received personal correspondence, preserved for us most richly in the letters of Cicero, Pliny the Younger, and the Emperor Julian, testifies to a literate information culture of considerable sophistication and depth. The Five Good Emperors. The period from 96 to 180 CE is often described by historians as the era of the Five Good Emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, whose successive reigns are characterized in the historical record by competent, conscientious governance, the restraint of imperial power within reasonable limits, substantial investment in public infrastructure and cultural institutions, and the peaceful transmission of imperial authority through adoption of qualified successors, rather than biological inheritance. Edward Gibbon, whose monumental Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire has shaped Western understanding of the period for over 2 centuries, described the era of the Five Good Emperors as the moment in human history when the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, a characterization that, while perhaps idealized, still captures something genuine about the relative stability, expanding prosperity, and administrative effectiveness that marked these 8 decades. The philosophical writings and personal character of Marcus Aurelius, the last of the five, have given this period a particular reflective quality in the historical imagination, the image of a man of genuine intellectual seriousness and moral earnestness ruling the largest empire the Western world had known with patient, methodical dedication. Writing his private philosophical reflections in a journal never intended for public eyes, seems to embody something quietly hopeful about what thoughtful human governance can look like at its best. Roman pottery and terra sigillata. Roman fine pottery, particularly the category known as terra sigillata, or Samian ware, produced in workshops of Gaul and Italy from the 1st century BCE through the 3rd century CE, represents one of the most widely distributed manufactured goods in all of the ancient world. A smooth, glossy, coral red ceramic ware produced through a sophisticated combination of refined clay, slip coating, and careful kiln firing technique that gave it a distinctive, warm, slightly glowing surface quality. Unlike the pottery of any other ancient culture, terra sigillata vessels, bowls, plates, cups, and serving dishes in standardized forms bearing mold-impressed decorations of mythological figures, hunting scenes, plant scrolls, and geometric borders, were manufactured in enormous quantities in organized workshop complexes in areas like Lisieux in central France and La Graufesenque in southern France, where multiple potters shared kilns and production facilities of industrial scale. Archaeological distribution maps showing the fine spots of terra sigillata, which extend from Scotland in the north to the eastern Mediterranean in the east and deep into sub-Saharan Africa through the Saharan trade routes, provide a remarkably clear visual impression of the geographic reach of Roman commercial networks, tracing in quiet red dots on dark maps the extent of a shared material culture that the Pax Romana made possible. The Roman year's festival calendar. The Roman calendar was dense with religious festivals, civic celebrations, market days, and commemorative observances that punctuated the year with a regular rhythm of public ceremony and communal gathering. The ancient Roman calendar included more than 40 officially recognized religious festivals, some ancient enough that their origins had been forgotten even by the Romans themselves, and the accumulated effect of these recurring ceremonial occasions was to give Roman civic life a textured, seasonal quality in which no month passed without its particular sequence of rituals, processions, games, or public banquets. Among the most beloved of all Roman festivals was the Saturnalia, celebrated in the second half of December in honor of the ancient agricultural deity Saturn. A week-long period of social inversion and festive relaxation during which the normally rigid social hierarchies were gently loosened, gifts were exchanged, normal work was suspended, public gambling was briefly permitted, and it was traditional for masters to serve dinner to their household slaves in a symbolic reversal of the usual order. The spring festival of the Floralia, celebrated at the end of April in honor of the goddess Flora who presided over flowers and the season of blossoming, was observed with garlands of fresh wildflowers decorating public spaces and the release of hares and goats through the streets, filling the early spring city with the colors, textures, and gentle movements of the natural world renewing itself. Hadrian, the traveling emperor. Emperor Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138 CE, is one of the most intellectually fascinating and personally distinctive figures in all of Roman imperial history. A ruler of restless curiosity and wide cultural interest who spent approximately 12 of his 21 years of reign traveling through the provinces of his empire, personally inspecting military installations, legal administration, building projects, and cultural institutions with a hands-on attentiveness that no previous emperor had demonstrated, and leaving behind him a trail of architectural commissions, civic improvements, and personal inscriptions from Britain to Egypt to Asia Minor. Hadrian was an accomplished architect in his own right, and scholars have traditionally attributed to his personal design involvement many of the buildings undertaken during his reign, including his extraordinary villa complex at Tivoli, whose sprawling gardens, pavilions, pools, and architectural fantasies still cover the Tiburtine hillside like a rich, complex meditation in stone and water on the landscapes the emperor had encountered during his extraordinary life of imperial travel. He was also a devoted student of Greek culture and philosophy, an accomplished poet in both Latin and Greek, and a man whose deep personal admiration for Greek civilization earned him the affectionate Greek nickname Philhellenos, the one who loves Greece, from the Athenian citizens who celebrated his many building gifts to their city. The Roman Empire's eastern trade routes. The Roman Empire maintained regular and substantial commercial contact with the civilizations of South Asia through two primary trade routes: the overland Silk Road traversing Central Asia and Persia, and the sea route through the Red Sea and across the Indian Ocean that was made navigable on a seasonal, reliable basis through Roman merchants' practical understanding of the monsoon wind system, which blows steadily toward India from May to September and back toward Arabia and Egypt from November to March, allowing laden ships to sail outward with one monsoon season and return with the next. The scale of this Indo-Roman maritime trade was considerable. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder estimated that approximately 550 million sesterces worth of goods flowed eastward from Rome to India each year, a figure representing an enormous commercial and monetary exchange. Archaeological evidence of this trade survives in the remains of Roman goods, coin hoards, pottery shards, glassware fragments and bronze figurines, found at trading sites along the coasts of southern India and Sri Lanka, while at the Red Sea port of Berenice in Egypt. Excavations have revealed warehouses containing enormous quantities of black pepper and other Indian commodities alongside Roman imports destined for the outward voyage, physical traces of one of the ancient world's most quietly remarkable long-distance commercial relationships. Roman imperial portraiture. Roman imperial portraiture, which survives in thousands of marble, bronze and gemstone examples from across the breadth of the empire and the full span of its history, developed over the centuries from the somewhat idealized portraits of the early imperial period, where Augustus is invariably shown with the smooth, gently idealized features of eternal youth, projecting an image of calm authority and divine favor, to the more psychologically penetrating and expressive styles of the later empire, where portraits of emperors like Caracalla show a focused, almost searching directness of gaze that seems to confront the viewer across 2 millennia with a quality of individual presence that is quietly startling. The formal conventions of imperial portraiture required that approved portrait types developed for each new emperor be disseminated in the form of official sculptural models distributed to workshops across the empire, so that a citizen in Roman Britain or Roman Syria looking at a marble portrait head in the local basilica would see the same idealized face that appeared on the coins in their pocket. A quiet, continuous reinforcement of the emperor's omnipresence across the physical breadth of the imperial world. The extraordinary variety of human faces preserved in Roman portrait sculpture, from the individualized wax masks of distinguished ancestors displayed at aristocratic funerals to the modest painted portraits on Egyptian mummy cases from Fayum, gives us a uniquely personal and humanizing glimpse into the ancient world, allowing us to look into the painted eyes of people who lived nearly 2,000 years ago with a sense of genuine, quiet human recognition. Roman bridges, engineering across rivers. The Romans constructed bridges of such structural quality and engineering precision that several dozen Roman bridge structures survive in more or less intact or functional condition across Europe and the Middle East today, the most celebrated being the Ponte Milvio in Rome, the Pont du Gard in France, the Roman Bridge of Salamanca in Spain, and the Bridge of Alcantara over the Tagus River in western Spain, whose 6 great arches of granite rise 48 meters above the river surface and whose dedicatory inscription records that it was built to last forever, an aspiration that, nearly 2,000 years later, seems not entirely unreasonable. Roman bridge construction used temporary wooden centering frameworks to support the semicircular stone arches during construction, and the carefully fitted stone voussoirs of the completed arch were so precisely cut and so securely locked together by their own compression that, in many Roman bridges, the joints contain no mortar at all, the stones simply resting against each other in a state of quiet, self-sustaining equilibrium that has proved more durable than the mortar used in later medieval construction. The width of Roman road bridges was standardized to accommodate the heaviest military and commercial traffic, wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass in opposite directions with room to spare, reflecting the Roman engineer's habit of building not merely for the immediate need but with a calm, long-term practicality that assumed the infrastructure would be serving its function for generations to come. The Roman army's camp architecture. The Roman legionary marching camp, the castra, was one of the most consistently applied pieces of architectural planning in the ancient world, laid out according to a standard template regardless of the terrain or the length of time the camp was intended to be occupied, with a rectangular perimeter defended by a ditch and earthen rampart topped with a wooden palisade, and an interior organized according to a fixed plan of intersecting roads, standard tent or barrack positions, the commander's headquarters at the center, and specific designated areas for the legionary shrines, granaries, workshops, and horse lines. The consistency of this planning was not simply a matter of habitual conservatism but reflected a practical understanding that soldiers who knew exactly where everything was located within a standard camp could find their assigned positions and respond to an alert quickly and without confusion even in the darkness or in a state of exhaustion following a long day's march. The permanent legionary fortresses, castra stativa, that developed from this template in the provinces of the empire were built in stone and timber to a level of comfort and permanence that gave them the character of small towns, complete with stone bath buildings, granaries designed to hold a full year's supply of grain, hospitals, workshops, and the commander's residence in a substantial stone courtyard building. Quiet, self-sufficient communities of professional soldiers settled along the quiet edges of empire. Roman sculpture's Greek inheritance. Roman sculpture existed in a complex, productive relationship of admiration, assimilation, and creative development with the Greek sculptural tradition that preceded it. The Romans so deeply admired original Greek bronze and marble sculptures that they imported enormous quantities of originals and commissioned hundreds of marble copies to fill the gardens, villas, public spaces, and temples of the Roman world, and the Roman sculptural copy industry became so sophisticated that many Greek originals now known only through Roman copies are represented in dozens of versions ranging in quality from the mediocre to the accomplished. Yet Roman sculpture was not merely derivative of its Greek predecessor but developed its own distinctive strengths and interests, particularly in the areas of portrait sculpture and historical narrative relief, where the Roman tradition of commemorating real, specific individuals and actual historical events with a commitment to likeness and documentary accuracy produced works of psychological depth and narrative vivid particularity quite unlike the idealized, universal quality of much Greek figure sculpture. The great narrative reliefs of Trajan's Column, the Era Pacis, and the Arch of Titus represent a distinctly Roman contribution to the history of sculpture, a tradition of using carved stone as a medium for organized, sequential narrative of real events, occupying a middle ground between the purely decorative and the genuinely historical that is as quietly fascinating today as it was celebrated in the ancient world. The Roman imperial bureaucracy. The administration of the vast Roman Empire was managed through a gradually expanding bureaucratic apparatus that developed over the centuries from the relatively informal arrangements of the early republic, where personal connections, delegated military authority, and the work of private households filled most administrative functions, to the elaborate, multi-tiered imperial administrative system of the later empire, where specialized departments staffed by professional scribes and administrators, organized in hierarchies of offices each with their own titles, responsibilities, and salary grades, managed the collection of taxes, the maintenance of roads and public buildings, the organization of the grain supply, the administration of justice, and the communication of imperial policy across the provinces. The backbone of the later imperial bureaucracy was the career of the equestrian class, men of substantial but non-senatorial wealth who served in a sequence of administrative and military positions organized in a carefully graduated hierarchy of salary grades known as decinarii, centenarii, and sexagenarii, after their annual salaries of 200,000, 100,000, and 60,000 sesterces respectively, creating a professional administrative class with a career structure and salary scale that would be recognizable in broad outline to a modern civil servant. The physical expression of this administrative machinery, the tabularia, or record offices with their shelves of wax tablets, papyrus rolls, and bronze inscription tablets, represented a quiet, essential infrastructure of organized knowledge that made coherent governance of an area of 5 million square kilometers a practical possibility. The Roman Aqueduct of Segovia. The Roman Aqueduct of Segovia in north-central Spain, which stands in remarkable completeness in the old city center of Segovia today, is one of the best preserved and most visually striking examples of Roman hydraulic engineering anywhere in the world. A soaring structure of 166 arches arranged in two tiers of honey-golden granite ashlar masonry rising to a maximum height of approximately 28.5 meters above the street level of the valley that separates the city's higher ground from the hillside where the aqueduct begins its descent. The structure was built without mortar, its precisely cut granite blocks held together solely by the compression of their own weight and the careful precision of their fitting, a characteristic Roman confidence in the self-sustaining logic of correctly assembled stone construction that has proven sufficient to maintain the structure's integrity for nearly 2,000 years. The aqueduct carried water from the Fuente Fria River in the Guadarrama Mountains approximately 17 kilometers to the city, running first in a covered underground channel and then emerging onto the spectacular final section of elevated arches in its approach to the city. A journey accomplished entirely by gravity through a gradient so gentle and precisely calculated that the water arrived at its destination in Segovia at exactly the pressure and volume required for the city's fountains and baths. The Roman Empire's linguistic diversity. While Latin served as the language of law, administration, the army, and formal public life throughout the western half of the Roman Empire, and Greek performed a comparable role in the more urbanized and culturally sophisticated eastern provinces, the actual linguistic landscape of the empire was in reality far more varied and complex, encompassing dozens of regional languages and dialects that continued to be spoken in homes and villages across the breadth of the imperial territory. Aramaic in Syria and Palestine, Coptic in rural Egypt, Punic in North Africa, Celtic languages in Gaul and Britain, Berber in Mauritania, and numerous other regional tongues that maintained their daily use alongside the official languages of the empire. The sociolinguistic situation in many parts of the empire was therefore one of practical multilingualism, where individuals might speak a regional language at home, communicate in Latin or Greek for official or commercial purposes, and navigate between several linguistic registers in the course of an ordinary week, a linguistic complexity that left traces in the vocabulary and grammatical structures of all the living Romance and other languages that descended from the late antique provincial cultures of the Roman world. The quiet persistence of these regional languages beneath the Latin overlay of official culture ensured that, as the political structures of the empire gradually transformed in the 5th and 6th centuries, the linguistic diversity of Europe was preserved in forms that would eventually blossom into the rich variety of modern European languages. Roman surgical instruments and medical practice. The surgical instrument sets found in archaeological excavations of Roman contexts, at Pompeii, at military hospital sites along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, and in the collections of medical practitioners buried with their tools, reveal a level of specialized, purpose-designed metalworking precision that reflects a sophisticated understanding of surgical anatomy and a commitment to the quality of the instruments used in medical practice. Roman surgical instruments were typically made of bronze or iron, sometimes with handles of bone, ivory, or wood, and included specialized tools for specific procedures, bone saws of fine, even teeth, sharp-bladed scalpels in a variety of sizes and shapes, bone levers, dilators, specula, lithotomy scoops for removing bladder stones, and the elaborate vaginal speculum, found at Pompeii, whose screw mechanism for controlled dilation of the instrument's valves demonstrates a level of mechanical engineering applied to medical instruments that was not substantially improved upon until the 19th century. Roman military surgeons working in the legionary valetudinaria were particularly skilled in the treatment of arrow and javelin wounds, fractures and amputations, and the existence of systematic military hospitals, with their separate wards, surgical facilities, and pharmaceutical stores, gave Roman legionaries access to organized medical care that dramatically improved their prospects of recovery from battlefield injuries. The Roman art of garden design. Roman garden design, which reached its most refined and sophisticated expression in the great private gardens of the wealthy and the imperial estates, combined formal geometric organization, symmetrical pathways, clipped hedges, topiary forms, and rectangular garden beds, with the pleasures of flowing water in fountains, cascades, and still reflecting pools, the fragrance of flowering plants and herbs, the shade of carefully placed trees, and the visual focal points of sculpture, painted garden murals, and decorative architectural elements to create spaces of multisensory beauty intended to offer a complete restorative experience for the mind and body. The garden paintings that survive from Pompeii and the Villa of Livia at Rome, frescoes depicting dense, luminous garden paradises of fruit trees heavy with oranges and pomegranates, birds perched among the branches against backgrounds of deep, still blue sky, and flowers of every kind blooming in a perpetual, gentle summer, suggest that the Roman imagination was deeply attracted to the idea of the garden as a kind of painted paradise, a world of organized natural beauty existing in perpetual, flowering abundance just beyond the walls of the room. Roman garden design traditions, transmitted through Latin agricultural texts and the survival of actual Roman garden layouts excavated at Pompeii and other sites, exercised a quiet influence on the development of Italian Renaissance garden design and, through it, on the entire subsequent tradition of European formal garden design. Trajan's Markets, an ancient commercial complex. Trajan's Markets, a multi-story commercial complex constructed in Rome in the early 2nd century CE as part of the broader program of building that created Trajan's Forum, represents one of the most functionally sophisticated urban architectural projects of the ancient world. A curved, tiered building of brick-faced concrete following the contours of the Quirinal Hill, containing approximately 150 individual commercial units arranged on 6 levels connected by an interior vaulted street, that served as a combination of commercial market, administrative offices, and perhaps a distribution center for the state's free grain and oil dole. The main street of the complex, the Via Biberatica, is still accessible today as one of the best preserved interior spaces of ancient Rome. A vaulted corridor lined on both sides with arched shop openings, whose brick surfaces have retained a warm amber-red tone through the centuries, giving the space a quality of contained, intimate enclosure that makes the scale of daily commercial activity in the ancient city immediately tangible. The complex demonstrates the Roman talent for combining practical functionality with architectural sophistication. The curved, terraced form following the natural contour of the hill behind it, the modular repetition of the arched shop units creating a harmonious rhythm of form and shadow across the facade, and the structural clarity of the concrete barrel vaults covering the interior spaces providing both stability and a clean, luminous simplicity of interior form. The Library of Roman Alexandria. The Great Library of Alexandria, though Greek rather than Roman in its origins, founded in the early 3rd century BCE by the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt in the cultural capital of Alexandria that Alexander the Great had established at the mouth of the Nile, became during the Roman imperial period one of the most important intellectual institutions under Roman patronage, continuing to attract scholars, scientists, philosophers, and poets from across the Mediterranean world to work in its scroll-filled rooms where natural light filtered through high windows onto long, scroll-laden shelves. The library is estimated at various points in its history to have housed between 400,000 and 700,000 papyrus scrolls, an accumulation of texts representing the broadest collection of Greek literary, scientific, philosophical, and mathematical knowledge ever assembled in a single institution, including works by Euclid, Archimedes, Eratosthenes, and hundreds of other scholars whose calculations, observations, and reasoning advanced human understanding of mathematics, astronomy, geography, medicine, and natural philosophy by centuries. The intellectual culture fostered by the Alexandrian library tradition, the systematic collection, copying, editing, and commentary upon existing texts combined with original research and observation, established a model of organized scholarship and accumulated, transmissible knowledge that became one of the most enduring contributions of the Greco-Roman world to the subsequent intellectual history of humanity. The Emperor Nero's Golden House. The Domus Aurea, the Golden House, built by the Emperor Nero in the years following the Great Fire of 64 CE, was one of the most extraordinary and architecturally innovative palaces ever constructed in the ancient world, a vast complex of rooms, gardens, and artificial landscape extending across an estimated 100 to 300 acres of the central hills of Rome, incorporating within its grounds wooded hillsides, vineyards, meadows, a small harbor and lake, and a great colonnaded portico that ancient sources claimed extended for a Roman mile in each direction from the palace's main entrance. The interior spaces of the Domus Aurea were decorated with wall paintings by the artist Fabullus in a fourth-style fresco manner of remarkable inventiveness, complex architectural fantasies of painted columns, festoons, and delicate decorative motifs on fields of white plaster that created the impression of refined, luminous space within the rooms. And many of the ceilings were vaulted and decorated with mosaics or carved stucco patterns studded with semi-precious stones and genuine ivory, inlays that gave the interiors their celebrated golden quality. When the palace was explored during the Renaissance, these buried rooms, which had been filled with rubble and built over after Nero's death, were discovered by artists who lowered themselves on ropes through holes in the ceilings to copy the wall paintings by the light of torches, calling the subterranean spaces grottos, and the distinctive decorative style of the paintings grotesque work, a term that quietly passed from those candle-lit underground Roman chambers into the vocabulary of European art history. Roman coinage portraits as political messages. Roman imperial coins served not merely as a practical medium of economic exchange but as one of the most effective and wide-reaching instruments of imperial communication available to the emperors. Tiny, portable, durable objects that circulated throughout the empire carrying on one face a carefully crafted portrait of the reigning emperor and on the other face a selected image or inscription conveying a chosen political, religious, or dynastic message to every person whose hand the coin passed through. The portrait types for each emperor were developed with considerable care and deliberate intent, the young Augustus choosing to be shown with the smooth, idealized features and gentle, somewhat distant gaze of a figure touched by divine favor, the bearded Hadrian adopting the full beard of Greek philosophical tradition as a subtle signal of his Phil-Hellenic cultural commitments. The fierce, close-cropped Caracalla projecting through his numismatic portrait an expression of commanding military intensity. Modern numismatists studying the evolutionary sequence of Roman imperial portrait styles can trace with remarkable precision the political and ideological messaging of each reign through the subtle changes in how emperors chose to present themselves. The hairstyles, the beard or its absence, the presence or absence of military insignia, and the particular combination of divine attributes that each emperor selected to define his public image across the breadth of the imperial world. Roman textile production and the wool trade. Textile production was one of the most economically important industries of the Roman world, and the organized washing, carding, spinning, weaving, fulling, and dyeing of wool and linen cloth employed a very substantial proportion of the Roman urban workforce in the specialized workshops, fulling mills, and dyeing establishments that were distributed across the residential and commercial neighborhoods of Roman cities from Pompeii to Lyon to York. The fulling industry, which processed newly woven woolen cloth by trampling it in troughs of warm water mixed with urine, whose ammonia content helped to clean and felt the fibers, before stretching, brushing, shearing, and pressing the finished fabric, was particularly important and widespread, with fouleries, identified by the distinctive arrangements of their treading troughs, being among the most commonly recognized commercial premises in archaeological investigations of Roman urban sites. The fine-textured, densely woven wool textiles of certain regions, the fleeces of the Apulian pastures in southern Italy, the high-quality wool production of certain Spanish provinces, and the fine linen of Egypt, commanded premium prices in the Roman luxury market and were traded across the length of the empire, their soft, dense textures and carefully maintained dye colors representing a quiet but economically significant dimension of the enormous system of interregional trade that the Roman road and sea networks made possible. The spread of Christianity through the Roman world. The gradual spread of Christianity through the urban networks of the Roman Empire during the first 3 centuries CE is one of the most significant and quietly remarkable processes of religious transformation in all of human history, following the pathways of Roman roads and sea routes, moving through the networks of Jewish diaspora communities and then into the broader Gentile population, spreading through the personal relationships of merchants, soldiers, household slaves, and traveling craftspeople to establish communities in cities from Jerusalem to Antioch to Alexandria to Rome itself within decades of the religion's origins in the eastern provinces. By the time Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan in 313 CE granting religious tolerance throughout the empire, Christianity had grown from a small sect in a distant eastern province to a religion with significant communities in virtually every major city of the empire, its followers numbering perhaps 5 to 10% of the total imperial population and including members of every social class from slaves and freed women to senators and members of the imperial court. The distinctive character of Roman infrastructure, the reliable roads and sea routes, the stable urban commercial networks, the widespread literacy in Latin and Greek that allowed the circulation of texts, and the overarching framework of a single political and economic system stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, provided the quiet, structural conditions that made possible this rapid, organic spread of a new religious community across an enormous and diverse geographic space. Roman amphitheaters across the empire. The Roman amphitheater, the elliptical, tiered seating structure designed to surround on all sides a central sand-covered arena, was built in cities throughout the Roman Empire as one of the most characteristic expressions of Roman urban culture, with over 200 identified amphitheater structures known from archaeological survey across the breadth of former Roman territory, from the well-preserved example at El Jem in Tunisia, whose golden stone tiers still rise to their full height in the Tunisian countryside, to smaller examples in Britain, Spain, France, Croatia, Turkey, and the Middle East that survive in varying states of preservation. The construction of a major civic amphitheater in a provincial city was a statement of urban ambition and cultural participation in the shared entertainments of the Roman world, an architectural declaration that the city was fully part of the community of Roman civilization and could offer its citizens the same organized public spectacles that were available in the capital. The technical demands of amphitheater construction, the complex geometry of the elliptical plan, the structural engineering of the tiered seating vaults, and the logistical organization of access staircases and passageways designed to allow the rapid admission and orderly evacuation of thousands of spectators, represented the application of Roman engineering skills to the particular problem of assembling large numbers of people in a single space for the purpose of shared communal entertainment. The Roman understanding of natural history. Pliny the Elder's Natural History, completed around 77 CE and dedicated to the Emperor Titus, stands as one of the most ambitious intellectual projects of the ancient world. A systematic encyclopedic survey of all natural knowledge available to a first-century Roman scholar, encompassing cosmology and astronomy, geography, zoology, botany, agriculture, medicine, mineralogy, and the history of art in 37 books totaling approximately 400,000 words and drawing on approximately 2,000 source works by around 500 different authors. What makes the natural history particularly fascinating as a document is the way it preserves, alongside genuine scientific observations of remarkable accuracy and insight, a rich collection of the mythological, folk, and anecdotal knowledge that the ancient world treated as equally valid data about the natural world, extraordinary creatures from distant lands, the medical properties of thousands of plants and minerals, and the remarkable customs of distant peoples, all recorded with the same calm, methodical attention and organized under the same encyclopedic framework as observations that modern science would readily confirm. Pliny the Elder perished in the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, approaching the cloud of volcanic ash from the Bay of Naples in his ship to observe it more closely and to assist with rescue operations. A death that his nephew Pliny the Younger described with quiet admiration as entirely consistent with his uncle's lifelong devotion to the direct, personal observation of natural phenomena. Roman sundials and the experience of public time. Sundials were a common feature of Roman public spaces, positioned in forums, temple precincts, bath complexes, and private gardens as instruments for marking the passage of the day's hours and as decorative objects whose polished stone or bronze surfaces and carefully incised hour lines combined functional precision with aesthetic refinement in the characteristic Roman manner. The Roman day was divided into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness, with the practical consequence that the hour was not a fixed unit of constant duration as it is in modern timekeeping, but rather a variable interval that expanded and contracted with the changing length of the day across the seasons, a summer daylight hour being considerably longer than a winter daylight hour, so that all activity tied to hourly time had a gentle, seasonal fluidity built into it. The philosophical implications of this approach to time, in which the basic unit of temporal experience was tied directly to the movement of the sun and the turning of the seasons rather than to an abstract, mechanical standard, gave Roman time a quality of organic, natural embeddedness in the rhythms of the physical world that seems, in quiet moments of reflection, to be a rather wise and beautiful way of orienting human activity within the larger temporal framework of nature. The Roman province of Britannia. The Roman province of Britannia, established following the conquest of the southern and central portions of the island of Britain initiated by Emperor Claudius in 43 CE, was one of the most geographically remote and climatically distinctive of all Roman provincial territories, a green, rainy, softly misted island at the northwestern edge of the known world, separated from the continent by the gray waters of the Channel and offering a landscape of rolling chalk downlands, dense temperate forests of oak and ash, wide river estuaries, and the long heathered moorlands of the north that the Romans found beautiful but demanding. Despite its remoteness, Britannia was developed into a genuine Roman province with a substantial urban network of regularly laid out cities, Londinium, London, Eboracum, York, Camulodunum, Colchester, and Aquae Sulis, Bath, among the most important, each with its forum, basilica, bath buildings, and temples, and connected to each other and to the ports of the continental coast by a well-maintained road system of approximately 10,000 kilometers. The hot thermal spring at Aquae Sulis, whose waters rose from the ground at a constant temperature of 45 degrees Celsius in a manner that seemed to Roman visitors both practically remarkable and mysteriously powerful, was developed into one of the most celebrated religious and therapeutic centers in the Roman West, its stone bath complex enclosing the naturally warm, slightly sulfurous water in a series of pools whose steaming surfaces must have seemed particularly welcoming in the cool, damp air of the British climate. Roman pottery stamps and trademarks. The practice of stamping Roman manufactured pottery with the name of the potter or workshop owner, applied in the wet clay before firing so that the name was permanently impressed into the base of the vessel in neat, precise lettering, represents one of the earliest and most widespread uses of makers' marks and trademarks in commercial history, providing modern archaeologists with an extraordinary resource for tracing the geographic distribution of individual workshops' products and reconstructing the commercial networks of the Roman world from the quiet evidence of potters' names preserved in fired clay. The potter's stamps of Gaulish terra sigillata workshops, in particular, have been studied with extraordinary thoroughness. Over 600 individual workshop names are known from the La Graufsenk production center alone, and the distribution of individual potters' named products across archaeological sites from Scotland to North Africa has allowed historians to trace specific commercial relationships and supply networks with a precision that would be impossible from literary sources alone. The practice of branding manufactured goods with their maker's identity, which implies a degree of established reputation, quality consciousness, and consumer awareness of source that sounds surprisingly modern, suggests that the Roman commercial economy was organized around concepts of brand recognition and product quality that we might recognize as fundamentally continuous with the commercial practices of the modern world. The Roman art of rhetoric. The art of rhetoric, the systematic study and practice of effective, persuasive public speaking, occupied a central place in Roman intellectual life and elite education that it would be difficult to overstate, being regarded not as a peripheral skill but as the fundamental intellectual and practical discipline of the educated Roman citizen, the medium through which political influence was exercised, legal cases were won, honors were bestowed, and the accumulated literary inheritance of the Greek and Latin traditions was transmitted and kept alive through the practice of the school exercise and the public demonstration. Cicero, the greatest Roman orator and one of the most accomplished practitioners of Latin prose style who ever lived, wrote extensively on the theory and practice of rhetoric in works like De Orator and Brutus, arguing that the ideal orator needed to combine broad philosophical education, deep knowledge of history and law, and highly developed emotional intelligence with the purely technical skills of voice, gesture, and argument construction, creating a complete human being of cultivated intellect and refined character. The training exercises of the Roman rhetorical schools, the controversiae, or imaginary legal cases, and the suasorii, or deliberative speeches on historical themes, developed in their students the ability to argue all sides of a question with equal facility and conviction, a cognitive flexibility that was explicitly valued as evidence of a well-trained, genuinely educated mind capable of seeing the complexity within apparently simple situations. Roman astronomy, Claudius Ptolemy's legacy. Claudius Ptolemy, a Greek-speaking mathematician, astronomer, and geographer working in Alexandria in the 2nd century CE during the height of the Roman imperial period, produced in his great astronomical treatise known in its Arabic transmission as the Almagest, the most complete and mathematically sophisticated model of the solar system produced in the ancient world. A geocentric model in which the Earth was held stationary at the center of the cosmos with the Sun, Moon, planets, and fixed stars revolving around it in complex combinations of circular motions called epicycles and deferents, calibrated with considerable mathematical precision to match the observed positions of the celestial bodies over time. While Ptolemy's geocentric model was ultimately superseded by the heliocentric model of Copernicus in the 16th century, the Almagest's mathematical techniques for modeling planetary motion using combinations of circular motions were sufficiently sophisticated and accurate that they were actively used for practical astronomical calculation, predicting eclipses, computing planetary positions, and establishing the dates of religious festivals, for over 1,400 years after their composition. One of the longest periods of sustained practical utility ever enjoyed by any scientific model in history. Ptolemy also produced a comprehensive treatise on mathematical geography, organizing the known world into a system of latitude and longitude coordinates and providing the data for constructing a map of the inhabited world, whose conceptual framework provided the foundation for European cartographic tradition from its recovery in the 15th century through to the age of global exploration. The Roman Empire's North African cities. The Roman provinces of North Africa, broadly encompassing the territories of modern Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, and Morocco, were among the wealthiest, most urbanized, and most culturally productive regions of the entire empire during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, their fertile coastal plains and well-irrigated hinterlands producing surplus grain, olive oil, and wild animals for the amphitheaters of the empire in quantities that made them central pillars of the Roman economy. While there, cities developed the sophisticated urban cultures, philosophical traditions, and ecclesiastical institutions that produced some of the most influential Latin writers of late antiquity. The ruins of Roman cities in North Africa, Leptis Magna in Libya, Spitla and Duga in Tunisia, Timgad and Gemala in Algeria, survive in a state of preservation that often exceeds that of comparable sites in Italy or Northern Europe, preserved by the dry North African climate beneath centuries of accumulated silt and wind-blown sand that protected their stone surfaces from the weathering effects of rain and frost. The city of Timgad in Algeria, founded as a Roman military colony in 100 CE and preserved almost in its entirety beneath the desert sand until excavation in the 19th century, presents perhaps the most complete picture available anywhere of the standard layout of a Roman colonial city. Its precisely laid-out grid of streets, forum complex, theater, baths, and residential neighborhoods creating a quiet, stone-paved portrait of the Roman urban ideal translated into the landscape of the Algerian high plains. Roman wax tablets and everyday writing. The everyday writing technology of the Roman world, for the routine recording of business accounts, personal notes, school exercises, legal drafts, and casual correspondence, was the wax tablet, a rectangular wooden frame filled with a smooth surface of black or natural-colored beeswax into which letters could be scratched with the pointed end of a bronze or bone stylus, and then erased by smoothing the wax surface again with the flat end of the same instrument, allowing the tablet to be used and reused indefinitely in a quiet, practical cycle of inscription and erasure. These wax tablets were often bound together in pairs or sets of 3 or more with leather thongs passing through holes at one edge, creating a diptych, or polyptych, that could be closed to protect the written surface and carried conveniently in a pocket or bag, an object so functionally well designed that it served as the standard everyday writing medium of the Roman world for many centuries. A remarkable archive of wooden writing tablets, preserved by the waterlogged conditions of a Roman drain excavated at Bloomberg in London in 2010, yielded 87 tablets bearing legible writing from the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, business accounts, legal proceedings, personal messages, and commercial records that preserve in extraordinary immediacy the texture of everyday economic and social life in Roman Londinium, the voices of merchants, moneylenders, and citizens speaking across 19 centuries from the written impressions in their thin sheets of waxed wood. The Roman imperial court and its rituals. The court of the Roman emperor, particularly from the 3rd century CE onward when the elaborate ceremonial traditions of the Eastern Roman tradition began to reshape the character of imperial public life, developed into one of the most formally elaborate and hierarchically organized ceremonial environments of the ancient world, a world of precisely graded protocols, regulated access, ritualized forms of address and gesture, and the quiet, pervasive symbolism of color, material, and spatial arrangement through which the extraordinary nature of the emperor's power and sacred status was expressed in the most immediate and physical terms possible. The emperor's use of the deep purple color called Tyrian purple, extracted from thousands of marine gastropod shells of the species Murex brandaris and Stramonida hemistoma in a production process of notable difficulty and expense, requiring approximately 12,000 shells to produce a single gram of pure dye, was so strongly associated with imperial authority that unauthorized use of the color in certain contexts was a serious legal offense, the physical rarity and production difficulty of the dye making it a perfect material embodiment of power that was genuinely inaccessible to those who did not possess imperial resources. The rituals of the imperial court, the morning ceremonies of access and greeting, the formal distribution of gifts and honorifics, the ceremonial meals and public appearances regulated by a detailed protocol whose mastery required years of education and careful attention, created around the emperor's person an organized, ritualized world of meaning that translated the abstract concept of imperial sovereignty into the concrete, immediate language of gesture, space, and material. Roman engineering, tunnels through mountains. Roman engineers constructed a number of significant tunnels through mountainous terrain for the purposes of road transport, drainage, and water supply, demonstrating their capability for executing complex underground excavation projects with a precision of alignment and gradient that required sophisticated survey techniques even before the work began. The Tunnel of Posillipo near Naples, a road tunnel approximately 711 meters in length, 4.5 meters wide, and up to 28 meters in height at certain points where the engineers enlarged the passage to admit light and air from shafts cut to the surface above, provided a direct passage through the Posillipo Hill that shortened the journey from Naples to Puteoli by many kilometers, and was so celebrated in the ancient world that the poet Virgil was said to have lived near its entrance. The drainage tunnel at Lake Fucino in central Italy, constructed by Emperor Claudius in the 1st century CE using a workforce reported by ancient sources at 30,000 laborers working for 11 years, was designed to lower the level of this landlocked lake to reclaim the surrounding fertile agricultural land. A tunnel approximately 5.6 kilometers in length excavated by teams working simultaneously from numerous vertical shafts sunk from the surface, whose separate sections were aligned with sufficient precision that when they met underground, the resulting junction errors were small enough to be easily accommodated. Roman glassmaking at Cologne. The Roman glassmaking workshops of Cologne, known in antiquity as Colonia Claudia Era Agrippinensium, founded as a Roman colony on the left bank of the Rhine River in 50 CE, produced during the 2nd and 3rd centuries some of the most technically accomplished and artistically sophisticated glass objects ever created in the Roman world, including the remarkable cage cups or diatrida, whose outer surface consists of a freely suspended openwork cage of glass threads and roundels separated from the inner cup by slender connecting struts, all carved from a single gather of glass by patient undercutting with abrasive tools in a process of extraordinary delicacy and skill. The production of a single cage cup, whose finished form consists of an outer glass network floating free of the inner drinking vessel, connected to it only by carefully preserved bridges of glass, is estimated to have required hundreds of hours of careful, concentrated work by a master craftsman using copper-tipped engraving tools and abrasive slurries, making each completed example both an extraordinary technical achievement and a quiet meditation on the possibilities of transparency and suspension achieved through the patient transformation of a material that is simultaneously liquid and solid. The glassworking tradition established in Roman Cologne was sufficiently deep-rooted that it survived and continued to develop through the post-Roman period, maintaining a thread of continuity between the Roman craftsmen who first established the workshops and the medieval Rhenish glass tradition that followed them. The Roman census and population records. The Roman census, the census from the Latin censura, meaning to assess or evaluate, was one of the oldest and most characteristic institutions of the Roman state, traditionally attributed to the 6th king of Rome, Servius Tullius, and practiced in the Republican period at 5-year intervals as a comprehensive registration of all Roman citizens, their family members, their wealth in various categories, and their consequent assignment to specific voting and military classes within the organized structure of Roman society. The census was administered by a pair of senior magistrates called censors, elected for a term of 18 months, who were responsible not only for the physical counting of citizens but also for the assessment and registration of their property, the assignment of public contracts and leases, the management of the public census lists and records, and the periodic review of the Senate membership to ensure it met the standards of wealth and character required for membership, a multifunction administrative role that combined what a modern state would distribute among a population registry office, a revenue service, a cadastral survey agency, and a parliamentary standards committee. The census records, maintained in the tabularium on the Capitoline Hill, provided the foundation data for the Roman state's understanding of its own population, resources, and military capacity, a statistical self-knowledge whose sophistication was not matched in Western Europe until the development of systematic national population statistics in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Roman Empire's final Western transformation. The conventional date of 476 CE, when the Germanic commander Odoacer deposed the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, the young Romulus Augustulus, and sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople rather than proclaiming a new Western emperor, is treated in historical convention as marking the formal end of the Western Roman Empire, though in reality the process it symbolizes was a gradual, complex, and geographically uneven transformation that unfolded across many decades and manifested differently in different regions of the former empire. In many parts of the former Western Empire, life continued with remarkable institutional continuity. The Roman Catholic Church preserved Latin literacy and ecclesiastical organization. Roman law continued to be applied in modified forms. Roman cities maintained their physical forms and some of their administrative functions, and the Roman agricultural and craft traditions continued to shape the material culture of the population. What changed was primarily at the political and military level. the centralized imperial administration was replaced by a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms whose rulers, while often adopting Roman titles and some Roman administrative practices, operated within fundamentally different political and cultural frameworks, while at the deeper levels of daily life, agricultural practice, religious observance, and material culture, the transformation from Roman to early medieval was a slow, quiet gradient rather than a sharp, decisive break. The Eastern Roman Empire's millennium of continuation. When the western half of the Roman Empire underwent its political transformation in the 5th century CE, the eastern half, centered on the magnificent city of Constantinople, founded by Emperor Constantine on the site of the Greek city of Byzantium at the strategic crossing point between Europe and Asia in 330 CE, not only survived but entered a period of renewed cultural vitality and administrative effectiveness that would sustain a Roman-identified civilization for nearly a full 1,000 years beyond the conventional Western end date. This Eastern Roman Empire, known to modern historians as the Byzantine Empire though its citizens called themselves Romans and their ruler the Roman Emperor throughout its history, maintained the tradition of Roman law and administration, preserved and transmitted the literary and philosophical heritage of Greek and Latin antiquity, produced extraordinary achievements in architecture. The Great Domed Basilica of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, completed in 537 CE, covered a dome of approximately 31 meters in diameter that floated above its nave on a ring of arched windows admitting so much light that contemporary observers described the dome as seeming to hang from a golden chain from heaven. An artistic expression in mosaic, manuscript illumination, and gold and enamel luxury crafts that represent one of the highest expressions of decorative art in human history. The Eastern Roman Empire finally concluded its extraordinary millennium of continuation in 1453 CE when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II captured Constantinople, a moment that marks the quiet, final close of a political and cultural tradition that had begun, in its Roman form, over 2,000 years before. Roman engineering, the Pantheon's oculus. The circular opening at the crown of the Pantheon's dome, the oculus, meaning in Latin, measures exactly 9 meters in diameter and represents perhaps the most perfect and quietly meditative architectural element surviving from the ancient Roman world, an unglazed opening to the sky through which falls a single, slowly moving column of sunlight that traces a circular arc across the coffered interior surface of the dome and the polished marble walls and floor below throughout the course of each day, turning the building's interior into a living sundial of enormous, calm, spatial beauty. The choice to leave the oculus unglazed, allowing not only light but also rain to fall into the interior, where it is collected by a slightly convex floor with imperceptible central drains set within the marble pavement, was a deliberate architectural and theological statement about the relationship between the protected interior of the sacred space and the wider sky and cosmos above, maintaining a physical connection between the enclosed human space and the open, infinite vault of the heavens. On certain significant dates in the Roman calendar, including the spring and autumn equinoxes and the winter solstice, the column of light entering through the oculus falls at calculated positions within the interior, illuminating the entrance portal on the equinoxes in such a way that a figure entering the building at noon would be bathed in a circular crown of light, suggesting that the building's orientation and geometry were chosen with a precise, contemplative attention to the movements of the sun that gave the interior an astronomical dimension as well as an architectural one. The role of slaves and freedmen in Roman society. Enslaved people occupied a central and complex position in the Roman economy and social structure, with estimates of the slave population in Roman Italy during the late Republic and early imperial period ranging from 1/4 to 1/3 of the total population, performing roles that range from agricultural labor on the great landed estates to the most sophisticated intellectual, administrative, and artistic functions in the service of wealthy households and the imperial court, a spectrum of experience so wide that it comprehends within the single legal category of slave situations of varying material comfort, social proximity to power, and practical autonomy that bear little resemblance to each other. The Roman institution of manumission, the legal freeing of enslaved people, was practiced with considerable frequency and created a large and socially important class of freedmen, who upon receiving their freedom, became Roman citizens of a specific legal status and often maintained close ties of obligation and personal loyalty to their former enslavers. Some freedmen in the imperial period rose to positions of extraordinary wealth and influence, particularly the freedmen secretaries of the imperial household who managed the correspondence, finances, and administration of the imperial palace, whose proximity to the center of power gave them an informal authority that was resented by the old aristocracy precisely because it so plainly demonstrated that competence and the emperor's trust, rather than birth and tradition, were the effective currencies of power in the new imperial world. Roman food preservation and garum. The Romans developed and practiced a sophisticated range of food preservation techniques: salting, smoking, drying, preserving in honey or vinegar, sealing in oil, and storing in the cool, constant temperature environments of deep stone-lined cellars that allowed them to move food commodities across the breadth of the empire and maintain dietary variety through the winter months when fresh produce was limited. And among these preserved products, perhaps none was more ubiquitous or more distinctively Roman than garum, the fermented fish sauce whose pungent, deeply savory flavor permeated Roman cooking from the humblest street stall to the most lavishly appointed aristocratic banquet. Garum was produced by layering fresh fish, typically anchovies, mackerel, or sardines, with large quantities of salt in open ceramic vats and leaving the mixture to ferment slowly in the warm Mediterranean sun for a period of weeks to months, during which the enzymatic action of the fish's own digestive bacteria broke down the proteins into a liquid of concentrated, complex, deeply umami flavor that the Romans used as a condiment, cooking ingredient, and flavor enhancer in the way that modern cooks use soy sauce or Worcestershire sauce. The largest garum production facilities, such as those at Pompeii, Carthago Nova in Spain, and Lixus in Morocco, were operated as industrial enterprises of considerable scale, their ceramic production vats and storage amphorae representing a specialized manufacturing industry that supplied the Roman culinary world with its most characteristic flavoring ingredient through an organized, commercially developed supply chain stretching across the western Mediterranean. The Roman Forum's layered history. The archaeological stratigraphy of the Roman Forum, the layers of human occupation, construction, demolition, and rebuilding compressed into the few meters of earth and rubble between the volcanic tufa of the original valley floor and the surface of the present-day ground, preserves within its quiet, sedimentary depth a compressed record of approximately 3,000 years of continuous human activity, from the Bronze Age burials of the earliest inhabitants of the Palatine and Capitoline hills through the Archaic period huts and sacred enclosures of the early city, the Great Republican building programs, the imperial rebuilding and decoration, the late antique reuse of monuments, the medieval occupation of ruins and construction of churches within the shells of ancient buildings, the Renaissance spoliation of marble and building materials, and the systematic archaeological excavation of the 19th and 20th centuries that gradually revealed the complex, layered record that visitors encounter today. Walking across the Roman Forum, one walks above the buried foundations of temples whose names are known from the literary sources but whose physical forms were only recovered through careful excavation. The Temple of Vesta with its circular plan and sacred eternal flame, the Temple of Saturn whose 8 surviving columns of Ionic gray granite still stand against the Roman sky, the Arch of Titus with its carved relief of the menorah and sacred vessels of Jerusalem being carried in triumphal procession, each emerging from the quiet ground as a fragment of a larger, mostly buried world whose recovery is still, in the gentlest sense, ongoing. Roman perfumed gardens and the concept of paradise. The Romans adopted and elaborated the ancient Persian concept of the paradisos, the enclosed, walled pleasure garden originally developed by the Persian kings as a carefully tended paradise of fragrant trees, flowing water, and beautiful animals, transforming it through their own horticultural traditions and aesthetic sensibilities into the Roman hortus, or pleasure garden that became one of the most desired and celebrated amenities of the wealthy Roman house and villa. The physical elements of the Roman pleasure garden, clipped hedges of sweet-smelling box and myrtle enclosing geometric beds of fragrant herbs and flowers, rose arbors and climbing jasmine on trellised pergolas, the gentle sound and movement of water in fountains and cascades, small statues of gods and mythological figures standing among the planting with a quiet, presiding calm, and shaded dining rooms called triclini, opening directly onto the garden space for outdoor summer meals, were designed to engage all 5 senses simultaneously in a total experience of cultivated natural beauty. The survival in Roman Pompeii, sealed beneath the volcanic ash of 79 CE, of actual garden layouts with their root channels, planting beds, fountain basins, and the fresco garden paintings that covered the interior walls of garden rooms, has given archaeologists and garden historians an uniquely complete picture of the physical and visual reality of the Roman garden. A place of green, fragrant, sun-warmed, water-cooled beauty that the Romans themselves understood as a small human-made image of the paradisial perfection toward which the natural world perpetually tends. The Roman legacy in modern architecture. The architectural legacy of Rome is so deeply embedded in the visual language of Western civilization that it surrounds the inhabitants of modern cities as a constant, often unnoticed presence. In the colonnaded porticos of government buildings and courts of justice from Washington to London to New Delhi, in the barrel-vaulted ceilings of railway stations and museums that translate Roman engineering principles into the materials and structural systems of the industrial age, in the use of the triumphal arch form on monuments from the Arc de Triomphe in Paris to the Washington Square Arch in New York, and in the recurrent use of the dome as the symbolic crown of public institutions whose designers wish to associate their buildings with the authority, permanence, and civic dignity that Roman architecture had made the dome's primary cultural meaning. The specific proportions, ornamental vocabulary, and compositional principles of classical Roman architecture, codified and transmitted through the ancient treatise of Vitruvius and then re-examined, measured, and published in the architectural literature of the Renaissance, have provided Western architects with a shared formal language of extraordinary richness and flexibility, capable of being used with strict archaeological fidelity, freely adapted and recombined, or subverted and ironized, but never entirely escaped, because its roots are too deep and its cultural associations too rich and various to be set aside. The Pantheon in Rome, studied and drawn by every generation of Western architects from Brunelleschi to Jefferson to Wren, has been described as the most influential building in Western history, a quiet measure of the depth and reach of Rome's contribution to the built world we inhabit. The Eternal City, Rome's continuous thread. Of all the astonishing statistics and facts that characterize the Roman civilization, its millions of subjects, its thousands of miles of roads, its centuries of artistic and intellectual achievement, its extraordinary engineering works, its deep contributions to law, language, and political thought, perhaps the most quietly remarkable is the simple continuity of Rome itself, a city that has been continuously inhabited on the same hills above the same river for approximately 28 centuries, carrying within its layered earth and enduring stones a sedimentary record of human civilization that extends without interruption from the Bronze Age village of the Palatine Hill to the living, breathing, contemporary city of today. The streets of Rome are paved above the streets of medieval Rome, which are paved above the streets of late antique Rome, which rest on the paving stones of imperial Rome, which were laid upon the pathways of republican Rome, which followed the tracks of the city's earliest inhabitants. An accumulation of human presence so deep and continuous that simply walking through the city's historic center is a quiet act of temporal layering, each step covering ground that has been trodden by an unbroken chain of human feet stretching back through the centuries to the very earliest moments of Western civilization. It is this quality of continuous, unbroken presence, the city's ability to carry forward the memory of its ancient self through all the transformations of 2.5 millennia, that gives Rome its particular character among all the cities of the world, and that makes the study of its ancient history feel less like an encounter with something remote and finished than like a conversation, conducted across a very long distance of time, with something that is still, in the deepest sense, alive and present. And there we rest, dear listener, at the quiet end of 100 gentle journeys through the long, luminous story of Rome. From the 7 rolling hills where a small city of thatched rooftops and earthen pathways first took form beside the slow curve of the Tiber, all the way to the enduring stone and marble that still stands beneath the open Italian sky today, the story of Rome is truly humanity's own, a long, patient, and quietly beautiful record of what we are capable of building, creating, and leaving behind. May these facts carry you gently toward rest, and may the warm, ancient light of Rome follow softly into your dreams.